Right, this is going to be another episode of Thorinquiry, my interview series here on my side channel. And my guest for this one is going to be... Actually, how do you technically describe yourself? Is it Owen Cyclops is what's supposed to be, and Owen Broadcast is like the Twitter or something? What's the angle? Which way around do you say it?
I am Owen Cyclops, and then, my handle on Twitter, Instagram, and places like that is Owen Broadcast.
There you go. Okay, so Owen is a cartoonist. I mean, he's a lot of things, but that's just how you'd reductively describe him. And he's famous for his Twitter. Well, I mean, funnily enough, if you buy volume 1 of his comics, this is basically what is explained in the intro. And then the first comics is he was someone who was doing some writing online and referencing whatever topical things, political or religious things he thought about. And then he also did comics. And then he eventually decided to go against the Ghostbusters advice and cross the streams. And in doing so, potentially evoked something much greater. So that's basically a lot of your work. I know it says autobiographical in that sense. So what I want to start off with, first of all, I know you don't know me, man. I'm a guy from the weird esports world, and it's a totally different world. And I don't expect you to know any of my background, but one of the things I'm quite famous for is look, I'm slightly just a bit of an unsocialized arsehole, but I make that sound like I'm just like an interviewer that asks the real questions, whatever. So I'll start out with the first question. I'll try to frame it politely, but I mean, it'll just sound weird no matter how I say it. So it'll start like this. Basically, if people see your work and I say you're a cartoonist or an artist, the first thing I think people might be surprised by is you're not like some super technically gifted artist. Would that be fair to say?
I think I know what you're getting at. Of course, I would say I'm a very technically gifted person. But no, I know what you're getting at. There's a kind of like simplicity to everything that I've really gravitated towards.
Is that intentional? You actually try to like have that very simple art style?
Yeah, actually it's super intentional. Yeah. My background, I've done a lot of stuff that people probably wouldn't know about. I mean, they wouldn't because I don't tell them. But yeah, I used to do like classical oil painting, pretty much every 2D thing I've done. But yeah, like back in the day, I used to go to places where you would do the kind of thing where it's like, we're going to spend a month drawing a pitcher of water and an apple and an orange on this desk in charcoal, that kind of like really classical stuff. But over time, I really have gravitated towards a kind of like super, I guess you could say simple in a way style. And yeah, man, it's definitely intentional.
Right. Because that was one thing I want to start with, actually, which is one thing I really enjoy about your work, actually, is I will say it looks very strange, but at the same time, like it doesn't... I don't actually find that's any sort of a burden on the work. Like I find all the ideas get through and your voice comes through very well. Obviously, it's a very like unique style of art. Like it's very idiosyncratic, but I think people sort of like your eye quickly adjusts to it. So what I was actually going to ask initially, because obviously I hope we're going to talk about like ideas and what the imagination is. So what I want to ask initially was one thing I thought is really brilliant about your work, just as an aesthetic, is it should encourage people actually that if you have great ideas or you have something you want to express, there isn't an enormous technical hurdle to get over. Am I right in saying that? Obviously, like you say, you potentially have like learned the rules, as it were, to break the rules. But I wanted you to maybe talk to this aspect.
Yeah, it's funny that you picked up on that because something from my past that I talk about a little bit, but not too much, is that I used to work with kids a lot. And I really noticed that I was like doing a lot of like, let's say art education with young kids. And I noticed that, if you show someone, this applies for adults also, if you show them an oil painting, there's such a large gap that they might think it's cool or interesting, but most people don't go to a museum and see a huge oil painting and think, oh, I could do that because the gap is so large. Whereas if you're at, a diner and you take a napkin and just draw something cool on the napkin and show it to someone, there's a kind of magic there where it's like, oh, the gap is so small. You're like, maybe if I had the right pen and the right idea, I really could just do that right here. And working in that gap, and I think it's sort of a kind of magical thing in a way, is a big magnet in my work. It's been a big draw for my work. And I think that that's part of why I gravitated towards a simple style, you could say, yeah.
Fair enough. So one thing I want to start off with is, as I referenced, obviously your work is quite autobiographical, but at the same time, one thing I noticed when I was reading it is clearly some of these characters aren't you, or they're you just addressing an idea. So what I want to ask was, without going specifically piece by piece by piece, right? How often is it where it's more like when a stand-up comedian's like, I just flew into town the other day. It's like, he didn't really, but it's like, that's the setup to the joke and what he does to then deliver a great. How much of it is like a conceit, and how often are you actually bleeding through like, this really was a literal life experience of yours? Because I get the vibe like the two can become quite interchangeable.
Yeah, definitely. If I present anything as real, it actually is real. So I don't do the stand-up comedy thing of like, I just got out of a cab the other day, if that didn't really happen.
Right.
So if I present anything as real, it is real. There is a little bit of a gray area where sometimes things will happen and then they will spark an idea that's so close to what actually happened, but maybe has like a magical or fantastical element to it. But normally I'm really not making it up out of whole cloth. Normally I am jumping off of things that actually happened, or for characters, it kind of goes into the art thing, but I'm really not a writer per se. So I usually am jumping off of people that actually exist, rather than making them up out of like whole cloth. Yeah.
I realize asking this question about comics might sound silly, because inherently comics are allowed to be silly and fantastical and out there, and everyone knows like our Crom work and stuff. But how much are you actually sometimes also using like dream logic type stuff where it doesn't have to really make sense to like a rational, art literature style breakdown? It's just like it's the idea kind of running wild.
Yeah, well, there is a sort of thing with the writing where I think part of, hopefully, I guess, what people like about my work maybe, and what keeps it exciting for me, is that I've always tried to never, pull the car off on the side of the highway and stay in one parking lot too long. So like, for example, like the book is a perfect example. I released an anthology of my comics last year. You can actually see, I think I write about it in the book a little bit, but for a while, it's like I was hitting the gas 100%. The fruit was just falling from the tree really easily. And I realized I hit this, let's say parking lot zone of, okay, I'm setting up these stories like, here's this guy, he encounters something weird and magical, and then here's the next thing that happens. And that was sort of becoming a formula. And the second I realized it was a formula, I just tabled it and moved on and kept going. And I think that's part of a hallmark of my work, is that I'll find a little pocket of writing, I forget what words you use, but like magical thinking or things like that. I'll find a little zone, but the second I get comfortable, I'm off again and I'm changing the story and I'm hitting something else. So it's hard to say. It's almost like the pattern is trying to make it so there's no formula, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, actually, by the way, that's also the reason why I would even say if people read this volume, it's also going to, I think that's even an angle you may be undersold when you're marketing this book, mate, is normally when people do comics like that, it's like within the first 2 chapters, you're locked into whatever the conceit is. So if it's like Peanuts, you're in the world of Peanuts, it's going to be Snoopy, it's going to be fucking Charlie Brown, it's going to be the same, the same like 5 possible scenarios going to play. Now, look, they're going to be executed brilliantly, which is what everyone loves about Peanuts, but you're not going to ever like have like some crazy thing where they go to New York City or something in Peanuts. Similarly, if you read like, a good example in the modern day might be like Scott Pilgrim or something, you're again going to quickly know like what sort of meta commentary they're doing. One thing I found very good about your work actually is, like you say, it never stops going, mate. It just keeps going from topic to topic to topic to like, here's things that happened when I was young, here's some crazy like fucking religious or like paranormal idea, but then here's right back into almost like a funny insight about life. Like the variety seems very interesting. So one thing I wanted to ask was, is this the way your mind just works? Like, is this almost like you just tap it into whatever you're thinking about at that moment? Do you have a big store of ideas and then you pick from the ones that are ripe like fruit? How are you deciding what to put in the work?
Yeah, that's a great question. You played it well in the beginning. You actually do have really good penetrating questions for sure. Well, yeah, that definitely is how my mind works. There's a poem from this poet Rilke, who's German. And he says basically in this poem, he's like a bird circling this tower, and he's not sure what the tower is, but the circles are getting closer and closer and closer around this tower. I think that is an element to the madness. It's not totally random. I am circling around certain things. But on the other hand, yeah, as an artist, my problem, I guess you could say, is I've always had way too many ideas. I mean, I could I feel like whether they're good or not, I think they're good, but I feel like pretty much every day I could get up and come up with like a handful of new ideas and just do that every day for the rest of my life. And then the problem is getting those seeds in the ground and growing them. Some people have the opposite problem, but that's my problem. And yeah, that's part of why I gravitated towards comics. At a certain point, I was like, you know, it would be the most efficacious for me to just get the factory going. And now I'm at the point where, so now I've kind of, I guess you could say, graduated to doing a weekly series. So I do like 3 comics a week. And now it's like, if something's floating around in the ether there, I'll just grab it and pin it down. Boom. Like almost every other day at this point now. So yeah, that is sort of how my mind works. The flip side of that is that there is a course running through it all. I think it has something to do with philosophy, religion, thinking about life, the weird space where really big, seemingly abstract ideas touch everyday aspects of real life in unexpected ways. It sounds kind of pretentious, but I really am sort of my scholarship, I guess you could say, my reading and everything is really about like mysticism. Right. That would be like the weird parts of religion is how I would describe it to most people. That's always been like a pretty all-consuming obsession for me. And it dovetails perfectly with the art. I'm sure most people can imagine if you're obsessed with like weird, religious-y, spiritually stuff, it fits with a puzzle piece into art perfectly and always has for like all of human history, in my opinion.
By the way, again, this does sound like something someone in a coffee shop with a berry asks, but are you familiar with the work of Proust at all?
Oh, my wife would kill me for saying no. A little
don't
bit,
worry
but
about
not
it.
really.
It's not a problem. Basically,
only in like the meme sense.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
I know
No. Here's the thing.
Yeah.
For the question, you don't need to be. I just thought I'd ask anyway, since you're an artist. I just wondered. Right. Basically, the very like this is actually one of the most famous. Like fucking could be on the back of a lollipop stick, mate. It's so simple as a reductive way of describing it. One of the things people often say about Proust's work, which I found from the amount I'd read, which was like I understood why there was like a big appeal to it, is because essentially he's someone who set out to write a novel and then just never stopped, and a novel became like many novels. But then he'd sort of like done that thing which, as someone who's a creative person who does a lot of research myself, I can find is a problem, which is when you go down the rabbit hole and you find another rabbit hole, you find another rabbit hole, what you're doing is, I almost think the analogy is like a microscope. You're like zooming in further. Ooh, there's something there, zooming in further. Maybe people could think of that like fucking totally cursed modern art thing they keep doing on Instagram, where the person could zoom out like 10 million fucking things from a dot and it has like all those images drawn into it, right? So you're zooming in, and it's like the idea is what's allowing you to follow the path of this idea is you're just saying, basically, I'm going to go wherever this idea gets. And so because you're searching, you know, panning for gold, you don't mind that you're going past all this crap, you just keep going for the next thing. The problem when you do that is, if someone gets lost as they're coming in with you, as it were, on the experience when you explain it in art, then they're going to think like, this guy's like overthought this, or like, this is kind of a bit wanky, you know, it's a bit self-indulgent. But the thing that's going to work, and this is what I think has made Proust amazing to people, is it means that every now and then he would like, because he'd put this attention to attention, every now and then he would like hit some gold, and the gold would be something like a thought or a feeling that you yourself have had, the reader, but you have never even heard conceptualized or verbalized by anyone in your life. And suddenly you have that thought, like, whoa, wait, I've actually literally thought that. And it's never even occurred outside of sort of the bounds of my mind, as it were. I find actually your work has that quality a lot, mate. Like there's a number of times you've told what might seem like an embarrassing story or some thought you had when something occurred in just an everyday interaction. And that was a similar vibe I was getting. I was like, man, I've never actually seen anyone else describe, like, have I even told anyone that? Have I ever described it? What would you say to this?
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I'm really glad you feel that way. No, definitely, dude. That's definitely something I try. You know, it's funny because it's almost like you can't try too hard to do that, because then it comes off as like, well, trying too hard and like pretentious, you know, but when it naturally happens, yeah, man, that's like the most epic thing, dude. Like honestly, with all my work, I was thinking the other day, you know, I do pretty well. I do okay here, you know, in terms of like getting things out there and how it's received. But the only feedback that really like hits me is when people tell me stuff like that. When they're like, I was reading this and it just, wow, like perfectly. I was like, did I write this? You know, that kind of feedback is like perfect for me. And yeah, I think it fits in with my interests a lot, because it kind of touches a lot of things, you know, like we're talking about, but the nature of like religion and mystical stuff, I think a lot of people at this time probably think of religion just as like superstition, maybe if they haven't had any experience with it. But there really is an aspect of it that I love, where it's like, here's this, crazy out there, seemingly purely philosophical debate from like the 1500s. And you can kind of just grab the string and pull it and be like, hey, isn't that kind of like this thing you experience every day? Or like, here's this thing that relates to an aspect of your life that you've already encountered all the time. And I think tying those big threads around is something that I really, really, really love. For a variety of reasons. Partially, it's because I can take this thing that I really love and then show it to other people in this really genuine way. Because for me, a lot of the really heady, crazy, out there ideas, like when I think about practical applications of them, I'm thinking of like when I'm kind of like addicted to coffee, or like when my friend's in like a weird relationship with a girl and he's not sure what to do. It's like I can sort of shine this light and show people this aspect of this thing that I really love in a way that does what you just said, where you're like, whoa, that really is like my real life. Yeah. I love that, man. That's great.
One thing I very much enjoyed actually about like the philosophical and religious bent of your work is definitely this idea, you've already referenced it yourself, is that you're not someone who's like, right, this is the religion I believe. And I'm like, I think of some religious people, dude, it's like they're just too into Warhammer, if you know that game. They're just the guy who has all the books and they've read all the lore. And like, well, actually, what he was trying to refer to, and they're just that guy, where it's like they've learned a bunch of rules and a bunch of fucking concepts. But I just wonder, like, how much of that's just in a book that you memorized, though? Whereas what I like about your work is you've already said the key word, mysticism. Like, if people don't know what this concept mean, I would say actually a book I really enjoyed that touched on this was a book called The Outsider by Colin Wilson, where he tried to look at great men in history and like the different lens that they looked through the world via. So when he picked this like religious guy from England in like, I don't know, many, many centuries ago now, who was kind of like a firebrand preacher who was willing to be like a heretic and speak against things, it was the idea of mysticism. And if people don't understand what the differentiation is between like religion, mysticism, like mysticism's more the idea of like, I mean, without going too far into it, it's like the Gnostics. It's the idea that you don't just have an idea of, you can actually yourself experience like magical things. You can experience God. You can experience, I mean, saying supernatural forces doesn't really work because obviously we're trying to imply it's some sort of hierarchy that is in whatever reality is anyway. You can essentially just experience these things directly via your, listen, the problem again that you get into with all this stuff is everyone we're talking to and who's listening is so pinned into like a rational materialist worldview, even if they don't know it, that when I say things like reality or like you can experience it directly, they're thinking like, you mean in real life, like a guy appears? It's like, well, no, but like think about your imagination, your mind. What if through your mind you could access something that you did get the sense wasn't directly part of you, whatever you are, and was coming from externally? And in this case, for you, maybe it's God, maybe it's some external entity. What would you say to this aspect? Because it seems like this is actually sort of the bedrock of your work. A lot of the really interesting insights are coming from, it's not just ideas for you, right? You're sort of directly trying to, I mean, it sounds like at one point in time, you even have had the similar experience. You were trying to try a lot of psychs and trying different rituals and stuff. You were trying just directly to contact something, right?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Yeah. If people are totally unfamiliar, which is a lot of people because of, this time and milieu and everything, it was like that for me at one point also. Yeah, one really good example that I like to use is this book called the Tao Te Ching, which is like an ancient book of Chinese philosophy, religion, kind of. And that really turned me on to all this and really set my life on a totally different path, because I grew up in the context of like, basically whatever a caricature of religion would be, that's what I thought. Like, yeah, some people need like the superstitions, but I don't. So like, why would I, whatever, it's fine.
Yes.
But for me, the Tao Te Ching really kicked off a lot of stuff, because I highly recommend anyone read it. It's really short and it's written just in like little paragraphs, basically. But it really showed me that there was this aspect of religious thinking and mysticism that was kind of pointing to an aspect of life that other things weren't really getting at. It's kind of like a hidden aspect of life, but conversely, so it's hidden, but it's also very intrinsic and essential to everything. To make that not abstract at all, my favorite example from the Tao Te Ching is there's this poem in there that says, it's something like, we make a wheel and we join all the spokes of the wheel in the center, but it's because there's a hole in the middle of the wheel that you can actually use it. You take clay and make a clay pot, but you're actually using the empty space inside. you make a building, you build a room, but what you use is the empty space in the room. So in life, we use things that are to harness like what isn't there, to harness the negative space and the empty space between things. So you can imagine like things like that. I was like, wow, that's really true in this weird way. And I never would have thought of that. That was really what kicked me off on my whole journey, because I was like, wow, there is this aspect of viewing things in this other way or in these other ways that I've been totally shielded from, that I didn't even know existed. And that really kicked me off hard on the journey. I guess the other half of it is I kind of view a lot of religious stuff as being on a spectrum of like mystical to like legalist, let's say. So on the one hand, you have someone like tripping out like, whoa, man, isn't the cup empty, but you use the empty cup, man? And on the other hand, there is like an area where philosophy dovetails with religion that I think most people don't encounter also.
Sure.
And that's really interesting for me also. There you do get the guys like sitting around the table like, well, you know, if you have free will, then doesn't that mean you could do X? But if you can't do X, then doesn't that mean Y? And yes. I really enjoy that also because, again, it seems very divorced from real life, but at the same time, those are the problems that we really hit every day. You know, someone's addicted to something, like what does that really mean, and like how much power do they have to get out of it, and you know, things like that. So, but you have these two domains that seem very divorced from real life, but actually are almost like the most fundamental things from where I'm sitting. And yeah, in my work, I mean, I'm really obsessed with like going into that stuff and going deeper into it and learning more about life and myself and God and all that. And yeah, I think that that's like the coal that like fuels the train of my work for sure. It's like really an all-consuming obsession. I mean, even in the room that I'm in right now, the floor around my desk is literally littered with books about religion. Like I can see like 5 or 6 of them just on the floor. In the hallway here, there's a bookshelf I just filled up. It really is truly like a genuine all-consuming obsession, and has been for most of my life.
Sure. I mean, one thing I would maybe get into on this particular topic is people are going to hear about like concepts like using psychedelics to explore your mind, potentially religious ceremony and the things that accompany that, Eastern philosophy, and they're going to think things like, for example, this is an area I always notice people get really lost in. They're like, so you're recommending this? Wow, so you think people should do this? So how do I do this exactly? It's like, look, no, that's not what we're talking about at all. We're just talking about our experiences doing it. I don't think in any way, like my position on that is I don't recommend and I don't say it's bad. All I'll tell people is what I'm comfortable telling them, probably for my own particular reasons. And then I think it's up to everyone to have personal self-responsibility, and you figure out what you need to do in your life. Because the problem I have is this. On the one hand, if you want to go back to like free will concepts, maybe even, I don't want to be the one that tells someone, do this, because they aren't me and I don't know how they do it. And they could obviously easily fuck things up. And I often tell people who are like fans of mine in my Discord, for example, that like, trying to do like magical ceremonies and take psychedelics when you don't really know what you're doing, which, spoiler, is sort of all of us, is like letting a kid have like BIOS access to their PC where they can go to like the absolute lowest level. And in theory, look, the reason why you'd want BIOS access is you could start unlocking a lot of the power of the PC and you could do all different things with it and change settings. But the reason I'm giving the analogy of the kid is we all know the kid wouldn't know what they're doing and they'd fuck it up, and within a week they'd have a broken computer. So the problem is, on the one hand, look, you can really fuck your computer up if you do this, but on the other hand, this is the boomer analogy, but if anyone's the same age as me, they'll get it. Would you want to just experience the internet through the AOL application and back in the day when you put the CD in and it was like a locked area where you could only sort of go to like X amount of websites, you could never sort of go free range, as it were, you couldn't interact. It was like you were sort of in like a Disneyland of the internet, if you know what I mean. So on the other hand, like I can't really say that's recommended either. Like I obviously didn't do that with my life and I wouldn't recommend that either. So what would you say to this angle? Because I do think these are areas that, to me, I'm similar to you, mate. I'm almost compelled to look into them. I find them so fascinating. I do find that when I pan these areas, I get gold. I also sometimes have really bad experiences. Like you've definitely documented some. I have some amazing ones. What would you say your perspective on this sort of stuff is?
Yeah, that's all really interesting. That definitely became a big aspect of my work, especially in the beginning. The analogy I would use is like, I definitely spent a long time with my face like pressed against the glass, so to speak, being like, what's on the other side of this glass? Like, and a lot of that entailed psychedelics, things like that, things of that nature for sure. It's interesting because feel like some of my writing stuff really blew up in the beginning, blew up in my own little sphere. Because I have a little bit of an atypical view on it. I think that's also maybe hopefully what draws people into what I do, because I am like a hyper mystical oriented person and all that stuff. But I have a little bit of a different framework for it after going so hard into it for so long. Because I really do, I guess it kind of always fractals out into bigger questions and stuff, but I really do believe in things like good and evil. I believe in God and all that stuff, which implies like a purpose for things. Sure. And an inherent structure to reality and things like that. I believe in like demons and all that stuff. I don't know if that surprises people or not. So I think that I'm kind of a rare case in a way, because I basically went as hard into the psychedelic stuff, I would say, as someone could without like going to live on like a commune or something. Like I was really doing it like all the time in a variety of ways, as often as I could. And I sort of came to the conclusion that I think is atypical for that world. I think it's atypical for someone to go as far into it as I did and then come back out and be like, yeah, good and evil like actually exists. And maybe there is like a nefarious, actually, I think there is kind of like a weird dark element to things, Sure. I like the analogy you used of like poking into the computer. For me, when I talk to people, I usually paint it more as like the jungle. And I'm like, you're going into like the jungle, and like everyone else is showing you postcards of the jungle and like National Geographic photos of the jungle. But like, they're probably not going to tell you that there are like headhunters in the jungle, and there are like tigers in the jungle and all that stuff. And also, I guess I am like reactionary against it in a way, because I feel like the larger cultural milieu, at least what I experienced, is like, oh, you're like a nerdy guy who's into like mystical and weird stuff. You should take acid and mushrooms. It's like
the low-level Joe Rogan premise of like what people used to be into for him. Like, wow, he's like a guy who smokes weed, man, and has crazy ideas, right? It's that sort of shit, right?
Yeah, and then for me, I guess, I guess you could say I'm like reactionary against it, because I am sort of like, there's a reason that fits into this particular worldview and context, and there's an
agenda behind it, right?
Yeah. Oh, I think so, for sure, man. For sure. I'm definitely like, if people don't know anything about like religious worldview and stuff, if you take like the Paradise Lost, John Milton, angels, demons fighting over humanity, like that's basically like what my worldview like boils down to. So yeah, I think it fits in. I think you could say agenda like socio-culturally, like there's a reason like, powerful people would like you to like, smoke weed and stuff, to put it lightly. But also, I think that there is like a larger spiritual warfare context that I really do think is real. And that's part of why I talked about it a lot at that time when my work was like breaking in that sort of world, because I felt like I had a unique take on it. And again, we talked about not pulling off into one zone and like pigeonholing yourself. I did hit a point where I was like, I really could be this guy. I could be the guy who's like, don't do ayahuasca. I did ayahuasca, but I didn't want to just be that person. But yeah, it's an undercurrent in what I do. I would have just dropped it forever and just never thought about it again. But because it's breaking so hard in the culture, every now and then I do dip back into it. And it does kind of touch on everything else that I am interested in and work with. Like I really like the computer analogy you used, because like when you go hard in that world, you meet people who are like, a few years into it. And it's like, if you start from a faulty premise and you just keep going down that road, sometimes it's really hard when you fall off that horse and you're like, oh, I made a miscalculation at square one, but now I'm at square like 250. Like that gets pretty difficult to unravel. I usually advise people not to do them. Actually, I do. I guess I'm being a little coy. I do, just because of my larger views about like demonic influence things like that. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Put it this way, I would also agree with you. Even though I think there is some very interesting stuff in this world, I think, even just a little bit of conspiracy research into that area will find all sorts of alphabet agencies all over the place directly promoting this stuff, think tanks coming up with these ideas, and the cultural pop culture icons that promoted it all. It all goes back to like poisoned sources, as it were, and poisoned wells. And I'd also say as well, I agree with you in terms of like there's a reason why they would want you to do these things. But here's the thing I found very interesting was, one thing I immediately touched on and resonated with in your work is that even the way you were trying some of these these things was a lot more than just kind of like a dilettante just dabbling and messing around. Like, for example, when you got into mushrooms, you were doing them in the silent darkness, in a room, on your own, without all. That's the other thing I've noticed, right, which is that in the way all those things are promoted in the modern day, it is always as part of a subculture. It is always in a specific setting that they want set up. So, for example, half the people who have taken LSD or mushrooms, they took it at a festival with certain pop music, which, spoiler, all ties back into what I was just referring to, and a certain agendas. Essentially, it's like they want you to take these things with, let's just say, their material, as it were. So it sort of like supercharges that, and it allows more of those influences, etc., to take seat in your mind, as it were. Whereas, yeah, I actually found the most interesting way to do it almost was to just, I mean, the analogy would be just, instead of just going on a little boat on top of the ocean, we put on the scuba gear and we just free dived all the way down as far as we could go, and then saw what really lurks below the surface. And sometimes that's beautiful, sometimes it's fucking terrifying, mate. So I would say that was one thing I found very interesting, because I have a similar vibe, basically, because I came from a very, I mean, originally like a traditional religious background, which I actually, quite frankly, I now realize I was never interacting mystically with any of those concepts. I was almost just like a guy who thought, like, this is my ethnicity or identity, if you know what I mean. Like, this is just who I am. Like, I have to know these things, and we all say these things. But then I came into the rational materialist worldview, and then I thought, same thing. Oh, it's almost just like primitive, isn't it? It's just their way of getting through the scared night when they hear the thunder. Haha, they don't know what thunder is, of course. The joke is, no one knows what thunder is. Like, you just have a scientific guy explain, he's your witch doctor, and he goes, don't worry, it's just sound of this thing. And you go, all right, don't have to worry about anything metaphysical then. Just continue on with life. And basically, the premise was, I get the vibe of what you were saying before. I always felt like it was like, is there really nothing else out there? And it was almost like the reason I was looking in these areas is I was like, there's got to be something in one of these. And my analogy would be, it's a bit like the idea of like getting high from weed or love. When you've never done it before, you have that thing of like, dude, are we actually high now? And if you ever have to ask that question, everyone knows the answer is no. Because the first time you really get high and you blow the fucking doors off, you're going to be very well aware. And if anything, you're going to be like, I think I'm too high right now. So I would say, like, yeah, I've had the feeling of like wanting to break through, wanting to see some more. And then once I got into that area, I would say I was a lot more careful afterwards, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, it's funny because also I sort of came from like the other angle on the road, where I was raised basically like atheist materialist. And then my encounter with the world, actually, it's kind of like what you just said, where I was like, oh, wait, there is this like super physical element to reality and like all this stuff. But then, yeah, I mean, if I had like it's sort of like around what you're asking me, kind of, if I had like a critique of like the modern psychedelic thing, I was reading a book the other day and they were talking about spiritualism. Spiritualism was like a thing more in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, of like seances and talking to ghosts and stuff like that. But this guy's critique of it was, he said, he had a really good soundbite. He said, it leads everywhere and nowhere, meaning that people get into it and it's like, yeah, but ... So what does this all mean though? And I feel like a lot of the psychedelic stuff and culture, it's really hard to fit it into a systemic framework without coming to like certain conclusions, or the systemic framework it's fit into is missing certain things, I guess you could say. And yeah, that was like a big, I guess you could say like a big like red pill for me over time. Something we're not touching on is that I was also really into like, I am very into like esoteric things, weird things like that. But I was floating around like Western occult world and certain aspects of Buddhism that touch on like what I would describe as like Asian occult stuff, as weird as that sounds.
Sure.
And yeah, over time, not so much with the Buddhism, but really with the Western occult stuff, I was floating around it and I really was like, I'm hitting a fork in the road where I'm wondering why I'm seeing good and evil in real life. I mean, I can see good and evil like with my own eyes. Like I can see that it's real, even if I can philosophically say, you know, oh, it's all just like waves and vibrations. Like at the end of the day, I can literally see it. And integrating that into my spiritual framework really changed a lot of things for me, because I feel like that is very antithetical to like the new age culture, even like materialism and like relativism and all that stuff. So it sort of like was the jumping off point from psychedelics for me, and like the occult esoterica stuff was like, okay, but I can see that there is sort of like a good team and a bad team, even if it's not as clear as like red jerseys and blue jerseys. And that was really weird and hard for me, man. I really worked through that in some of my work. And I feel like that still colors my work and everything because, yeah, again, it's like this place where all these things that seem totally unrelated to reality meet the reality of your everyday experience. And yeah, it was sort of a long walk from psychedelics, but that's sort of how I left that world. Was eventually I was like, this either isn't answering the questions I want it to, or I'm starting to wonder like if this is actually like good team behavior to put it in a weird way, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I would say as well is like when I was in that phase of my life where I was like, now I look back and I was searching for something. I was searching for something to sort of connect with and something that was real, not just like a menu of ideas, which all just seemed just like ideas, like something you hold temporarily in your mind, but there's no reality to it. There's nothing there is no gnosis, as it were. You don't really connect with something more. I would say when I look back now, I could even just as reduce it down to like, I wanted meaning in life. I wanted to be like a lens through which I could view all these things. And so to me, I felt like at that time in my life, I was quite unmoored. Whereas now, the funny thing is, I'm in a similar position, mate. Like, I do think essentially, like, if people know the C.S. Lewis work, the Screw Tape Letters, where it's like a demon and his uncle, like, describing, like, how you lead men astray, etc. That's kind of how I see the world. Like, I actually do think in some ways there are, like, I mean, we'll just use the simple term, there are good and evil forces and influences. I love the word influence particularly. I don't think it's as simple as you say of, like, it's not like Buffy. Like, everyone's not like, I am the demon on Team B, the evil ones, and I love being evil. Like, some of it's just influence to me. Some of it is absolutely, I do think there are entities and there are sort of like, it concretizes into certain things that in the imagination I would say are real. We'll just leave this terminology where it is. If people know what we're talking about, they know what we're talking about. Can't get lost in the weeds. But I think some of it, even as people, they don't know what it's like the Bible. They know not what they do. They're just doing these things. What's funny is they do think they're sometimes just doing it for money or just for profit or because, you know, we got to like do the right thing in society. They have all sorts of fucking weird reasons and window dressers to why they're doing it. But I do think ultimately behind the scenes, again, if I say there's a puppet master, people are going to think every aspect's like a chess game. I don't think it's as simple as that, but I do think there are these like pervasive and pernicious influences. And particularly, I will say, this is why I enjoy your work as well. I do think essentially, I'll make it very simple for you, mate. I think anything you can see on a screen or anything that is pushed in any context by the mainstream TM has to have some element of this influence. And so, for example, I'll say a very shocking thing to people who know my work. I work in the field of esports, which is basically like if video game tournaments were real sports and you followed them like they were a sport and did interviews with the players and tried to tell the story of some guy in Counter-Strike as though he was like Tom Brady in the NFL, right? Basically that world. Don't worry, I'm not excluding myself, mate. One of the reasons I think they allow me to get to the positions I'm in my life and have the success I have is because when I'm doing that stuff, there is a degree to which plenty of people are interacting with it just as distraction and bringing in things like tech ideas and making people become obsessed about looking into Black Mirror screens and going deep on certain concepts about reality and materialism. And we're even pitching certain products and foods and tech and so on. I'm part of it, and at a merry minimum, I'm part of it just because I'd make people stay on the computer more and click another video and keep watching and don't go and do something like read a philosophy book or something. So I don't exclude myself at all, but I do think essentially this is sort of the war that's going on in reality. And essentially, to throw in a last detail and then I'll chuck it to you, you do whatever you want with this. I know I go all over the place, but I like to sort of set it like that so you can pick what you vibe with. Basically, what I would say is this. If people are wondering, like, but where's the good side then? Where is God in all of this? It's like, he isn't on screens, mate. He isn't in Black Mirrors. That isn't his tech. That isn't what he uses it for. So at best, maybe people like me, if we're interacting with higher ideas, like I would say I do sort of put some stuff in there that's a little bit subversive in that sense. I try to sort of like give people a hint, throw them a bone, like maybe this isn't all there is to it. But I do think some of it is, I think that's just an inherently sort of dark world. I think actually part of, I mean, a lot of people have seemed like they're waking up to this. A part of it is you got to limit that stuff or you got to put it in a box in a way. You can't let it take over your life. What would you say to any of this?
Yeah, man, that's so interesting. That's like, I honestly legitimately like super interesting. Yeah, man, there's a lot there. Well, I mean, one thing you touched on that I just thought I would touch on really quickly is, yeah, I think part of it in the beginning is why I got so obsessed with like worldviews and how worldviews function, because it's like everyone has this like cohesive, maybe it's not cohesive, but everyone has this like, you know, like you mentioned before, like the programming software. Yes. It's like everyone has this worldview, and it's almost like you get it, especially with like hot button social issues. whether who's right or who's wrong. Sometimes it's like the worldview is like acting through them like a puppet, you know, and they say certain things, but if you really dig in, some people, not everyone, but some people, it's like you're just saying that because that's like what you're supposed to say. It's like the worldview is like wearing you like a glove. And I think that dovetails with like both spiritual and like cultural and all that stuff. But encountering that and hitting that really hard with people in real life is part of why I got so obsessed with worldviews and how like worldviews function. Because it's like a sweater, you know, all the threads are touching in this weird way and you can kind of untangle it. But honestly, the other thing you mentioned is so relevant to my everyday life, man. I have this concept, I guess you could call it like meeting the world like halfway. But as an illustrator, that's really a big part of what I do. I mean, materially, that's literally the case because, you know, I used to do oil painting and all that stuff. But you can imagine if I do things that are suited for screens instead, my work has so much more momentum. It can reach so much more people. So there's like a trade-off there of like, well, do I use like these really epic, expensive, cool materials, or is it worth the trade-off to cater it to the screen and then reach 100 times more people? But that trade-off also exists like informationally and also exists on like higher planes and levels. And that's really something that I've worked with a lot in my own mind and in my own practice, like a ton, man. I mean, it's part of why I really identify with like, not in a dishonest way, but I got this reading from this like weird like astrology woman one time when I was really into that. And she was like, your axis or whatever is the axis of masks, like wearing masks skillfully and using masks and all that kind of thing. And masks have a connotation of like dishonesty. So I never do that. But I think there is something about like the jester or the comedian who occupies this role of like, haha, it's just a joke. Like you were just saying, like we're on stage, like games, like we're all having fun. But then because you're up there, you're able to be like, oop, I just slipped in, like I'll slip in like one thing, or, you know, like in medieval times, you probably know, like the jester was someone who could do like social critique and even like make fun of the king because he's just like an idiot. Like he's just joking around. Like it's all just fun and games. And dude, that is one of the most interesting themes that I love. And
is that also part of why you keep the art style like that? Because like I say, if someone saw it, they would just think it was just like someone doing very simple art. Like, oh, it's just a silly 4-panel cartoon, right? You sort of it's sort of disarming, right?
Yeah. You're right in the beginning about cutting deep. Yeah, dude, exactly. Yeah, I used to do like, it would probably really surprise people, but I used to do like really big, dark artwork. Like one of the last things I did in that style was I literally had this like huge piece of wood and it was like painted black, and I drew over it in like white crayon and white chalk and white ink on top of the black, and it was like all these dark faces. So I used to go like really hard and really dark. And I noticed that, yeah, it's like people have their guard down more when that's not the case. I mean, the painting analogy is again perfect. If you walk into a museum and there's a 36, foot by 50-foot oil painting up on the wall, you're kind of expecting something from it and viewing it in a certain context. Whereas if you're walking down the street and someone did a little drawing on like the bus seat that you're sitting on waiting for the bus, it's a totally different context. You have your guard down 100%. And playing with that and working with that is a huge aspect of my life. I mean, like the fool archetype is something that I really, really, really identify with. And even online, again, I'm never dishonest, but using that foil of like, hey, it's just a joke, like I'm just joking, is so powerful, man. That's like almost the most magically powerful thing I feel like that you could even work with ever. Like if it's just a joke, but inside is something deeper. I mean, dude, I'm like smiling in real life right now. That's like it for me. That's like where the real artistry comes in for a lot of stuff for me personally. And that permeates all aspect of art that I like now. Like I even have a folder of like songs where the song is really happy. Like if anyone knows the song Tears from a Clown, perfect example. The song's really happy. If it came on the radio, you'd be like, oh, it's a cool song. But then if you listen to the lyrics, they're actually really dark. That kind of thing, I mean, just does it for me like 1,000%, man. And yeah, with the art, that's a perfect example. I love that. Like when I first got into popular illustrationing stuff, I guess you could say, what I would love is when I would show someone a drawing in real life and I could see their face and I could see them be like, oh yeah, that's cool, and sort of start to look away and then look back and be like, oh wait, like there's a hook. There's something else going on here. And yeah, I use that intentionally. I do that with the symbols and symbolism. Like sometimes if I have like a lot of interlocking symbols and themes, I'll put one thing that kind of sings out as like out of place that will clue someone in to like, oh wait, like why is there like, you know, like why is there like a Baphomet here? Why is there like a pagan god in this little weird like drawing? There must be something else going on here and things like that. So yeah, that like meeting the world halfway and sort of playing with the forces of the world on their territory a little bit is something I do hardcore. There is a back end to it though, where I'm really into like American Christianity. I'm American, so it's part of like my heritage, I guess you could say, spiritually, not literally. And that tension is something that runs all the way through for American Christianity for sure, especially for like evangelicals and things like that. There's this tension within it where it's like, we know that these certain forces of the world are bad. And half the people are like, okay, so we should stay away from them because we're not like that. Like we should stay out of it. It's really dangerous. And then you have half of people who are like, but couldn't we use this for our own positive ends? A crude example would be something like, you know, like network TV. I don't know. Let's say you're some Christian who thinks network TV is like really evil. You can imagine being at a table and some people are going to say, well, yeah, we shouldn't get involved in that. And some people are going to say, but if we went on, then we could, you know, slip in our message and stuff.
Yes.
And I find that really fascinating. And yeah, historically, it's just interesting to note it's a tension that runs all the way back through American Christianity, in my opinion, from like day one.
I mean, this is something directly you even address yourself on some of the autobiographical aspects. I notice you seem to come to it from a similar place as me, which is when you go down these rabbit holes. As you mentioned earlier, the other problem with going down these rabbit holes is when someone, in my analogy, fucks up the computer at like the operating system and BIOS level, then unfortunately a lot of them don't come back. A lot of them just stay like a broken guy who's going down the same road, or they just come back out and they let themselves get categorized by all the darker forces and the scientific way they would tell you that you're crazy and you need to be on this pill and that pill, and you know you've got all these psychological conditions, and they can put you in a neat little box and get rid of you, and anything you say is dismissed as silly and crazy. One of the key things about all this exploration to me is you have to be able to sort of come back out of it, no matter how much you've been tripping the light fantastic, as it were, and be able to interact with everyday life and, you know, eat a bowl of soup and talk to someone. And one thing you make very clear in some of your autobiographical comics is you found that like part of how you do that is you sort of do wear masks or filter it in some ways, or essentially it's like it's just social alignment. You read the room, you figure out who am I talking to here, and then you don't, you know, in your mind you bite your tongue and you don't tell your aunt at dinner at some, you know, some fucking family meeting like, yeah, actually the CIA was doing that in 1972 with like, you know, you just tell her something, yeah, it's crazy how that goes, isn't it? You know, that's not for her. You know, you can maybe drop a tiny breadcrumb for her, but unless she picks it up and seems very enthusiastic, and also it's your aunt, you maybe don't want your aunt to have that relationship with you, or even to go down those rabbit holes. Maybe that isn't her journey, as it were. So one thing I've noticed you do, which you touched on there, is it's something I had to learn myself, is you have to know, on the one hand, because these things have touched you and affected you, you want to talk about it with someone and you want to express the ideas, but you also, like the analogy before, you don't want to leave like a loaded gun around a bunch of kids, or you don't want to give someone like a book that they're not ready for, that basically if they actually read, I mean, it would have the effect of what you talk about at the opening to your book. It might just blow their whole mind and warp them into something different, no matter what effect it had on you. So what I always do is, I noticed in your work, you drop a lot of breadcrumbs, dude, like, but you do it in a funny way. Like, I'll give you an example. When the guy in one of those comic strips was like looking at his, like, he was like, look at my table now. And what you've done is on the books, one of them, for example, I'll just give, I know this is like sort of showing how the magician did it, but on one of them, you've got a book that's by like, by an author called Cherub Lily. And all I'll say is if people took those two words and figured out what categories they're in, one's a type of angel, one's a flower, and they were to change that to a different angel and a different flower, there's a real book that he's referencing there, and a guy that has a very interesting set of ideas about sort of like spiritual and, let's just say, like alien realities and what they might be. And this obviously leads into a famous thing you were into. So I've noticed you do a lot of dropping breadcrumbs out, which is something I've tried to do as well. Because my philosophy is, I always say it like this. When I first went into those areas, especially, by the way, anything with secret societies or like hidden wisdom, I was doing that bullshit thing of like, oh, it's all secret, is it? Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to bust in that room. I'm going to get all the secrets and I'm going to be like Robin Hood. I'm going to give them to everyone else and then there's going to be no more secrets. Aren't I mature? And what I realized was that's actually a very immature way of thinking. Like that is what a little kid who isn't ready to sort of figure out some things would think. And what I even learned was it's really dangerous to give stuff out in that way. Like I actually think there's a concept called unearned wisdom. And I think it applies to both ends, dude. It applies to people who are interested in these topics, but only as sort of like a dilettante. Like they just essentially, they almost want like a pornography of the occult. They want you to tell you all the filthy details of the ritual you did and what was it like, and then did it. They're never going to do it themselves, but they want to almost get off on the excitement of hearing about it and just the conception, which actually tells you, by the way, they're not really interfacing with it as a real thing. They're thinking of it like you're just describing a horror movie to them. It's like Hellraiser or something. And then there's also the angle that I also think, in a weird way, when you give out that info, when you've only just encountered it and haven't processed it, haven't made it real for you, haven't actually made it part of your life and meaning and milieu, I think actually that's unearned wisdom too. Like you're just sort of giving it away willy-nilly to someone else, whereas it's like, is that even really your thing to give away? So what I do is I just drop very small breadcrumbs every now and then, and I rely that if someone's legit, they'll pick up enough breadcrumbs, it'll lead them to something that they can then experience themselves. They don't have to get it from me. What do you think on this topic?
Yeah, dude. Yeah. Yeah, that's like pretty much exactly how I feel, for sure. I'm glad you picked up on that. There's other stuff like that in my work, like all the time. Yeah, it's funny because what you're making me think of is like everything you just said is like stone cold, like 100% true. Integrating all of that into who I am, and I think for other people I see it also in like a charitable way, I'm saying, can be like very difficult. I think most people are probably like maybe just from like pop culture are familiar with the term like tantric Buddhism and like tantric stuff.
Sure.
It makes most people think of like sex, but like what a tantra actually is, the word tantra comes from the word for web. It's like a set of teachings. Let's say like in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, it's like a set of teachings that you go into that you basically use to like change your mind up and like get enlightened and stuff like that. But they're secretive because you need a teacher to walk you through the tantra, and there's different tantras, and you find someone who's done it already and they kind of like walk you through the process. And then in the end, hopefully you've like changed your mind in some way, or gotten enlightened or whatever. My point is that I really kind of feel like, I don't know what term to use. I guess conspiracy theories is a little sloppy, but like everything that we've talked about, let's say like, sounds really pretentious, but like deprogramming yourself and figuring out what the truth is. That kind of, to me, is a tantra, because you go into that world and there's all this stuff. And just like a tantra, it has different chapters. And if you meet other people, you can kind of see what chapters they've done. Like if we met, at a party, we'd be talking, oh, did you do like the banking stuff? Did you do like the, this stuff? Did you do? So for me, in my mind, I categorize it kind of like a tantra, basically. It has different subsections. But my point is that we don't usually have people to like walk us through it or like to let us know what the pitfalls are, because that's really the function. The person is there walking you through it in the traditional stuff, because they could say, oh, you're having like these weird visions and like you're not sleeping, like you have to do this, or like don't get hung up on this part, you should go do this part. And in the very beginning, I think part of why I started getting online in the first place was that I could really see a lot of people getting channeled into, like, it sounds really pretentious, but just like traps or pitfalls that like other people had laid for them, where it's like, oh, if you're into X, Y, and Z, you're this type of person.
Right.
So if you're into A, B, and C, you're like this type of crazy weirdo. And working through that myself and figuring it out for myself and how I could still live in the world and be that kind of person was a huge part of my work and figuring things out and all that. So yeah, like, again, it kind of dovetails with the religion stuff, because I think for a lot of people, and me especially, for years, literally years, it was really difficult to get over the hurdle of, like what you just said with your aunt is a perfect example. Like, look, I'm showing you right here that the square is red and you're saying it's blue, but if you look right here, you can literally see the square is red. So what? Like, what's the problem here? And then eventually you kind of land in a space of like, well, I guess they just can't handle it, which kind of aggrandizes you, because you're like, well, I can handle it, they can't, whatever. Sure. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but that's sort of naturally where it leads. So for me, it kind of dovetails with the religion stuff, because I had to come to it in like a charitable context. And it fits back in with all the worldview stuff because it's like, there's a term in art, which is a tessellation. A tessellation is when all the shapes fit together perfectly on a plane. So for example, a beehive, like a honeycomb, all the hexagons fitting together are tessellated, or a simple example is a checkerboard. On a checkerboard, all the squares fit. There's no empty space. So I started to view people's view of life and the world and everything as like a tessellation, as like a carpet or a checkerboard, basically. And what you're asking someone to do in those moments is you're like, here's a triangle, just change out one of the squares with a triangle. Like, here you go. But it doesn't work that way. You can't just take a square out of a checkerboard and put a circle in, because it's going to mess up the whole checkerboard.
Yes.
And starting to view things that way, where I could take a way more charitable approach.
You're asking them to sort of rip up the whole roots of everything they believe, even though you might just be addressing one small thing. Like, this happened in this dimension, right?
Yeah, it touches everything. I mean, I'm sure everyone listening to this has encountered that at some point, even if it's just something like on the news, even if it's something on the news and you're sitting with your family and you're like, that's not really true. Like, look, here, I'll show you something else. Even that sometimes is too much for people. Yes. And it gets very difficult if you're that kind of person to not sort of, like aggrandize yourself and be like, well, I can handle it. They can't. They're little kids. I'm the adult. So again, I guess a fitting metaphor, it all fits together, because taking a charitable view of it and fitting it in with like the religion stuff and all that really allowed me to be that kind of person on the one hand, but also function in the world. And it took a really long time. I mean, for years, like literally, I would like bang my head against the wall every day. I feel like I was drinking a lot at the time because of it. And like, it was really difficult for me to live in the world where it's like, this guy's my best friend. I'm showing him the square is red. He's saying the square is blue. And now he's mad at me. But I didn't do anything wrong, man. The square is red. I'm looking right at it. So that kind of like tension was something that fueled a lot of my work and writing in the beginning. And it's reached a nice point of like stasis, where it's part of what I do, but I'm not like vexed by it. Vexed is like a perfect term. I'm not like pathologically confused by it anymore. So yeah, it's been like a fruitful aspect of what I do. And sometimes I try and, I guess you could say, send the flag out to other people who I can see are maybe like earlier along in the Tantra than me. Maybe they know more than me about certain things, but integrating that with real life is like an esoteric practice, like in and of itself, man.
Another thing I actually found that's quite funny is, because when people read your comics, if they read the first ones, which are some of the earliest ones, in some of these, especially about social settings, you're really sort of like out there and say some things that might even be embarrassing, or someone might even feel like secondhand embarrassment when they read, like, holy man, he's been very honest here, or this is really creatively written. I'd almost say, basically, if people don't know the gist of it, it's almost in the realm of, if you've ever read like Daniel Clowes type comics, where it's a lot of like very raw, like emotional, like things that teenagers would express, etc. But then one thing I've noticed about this area where you have been a lot more careful is, like I say, you just drop breadcrumbs sometimes too. Like, I've seen some references in there that I love, because basically they refer to the most out there possible, like, let's just keep it as theories to make it safe for people listening. The most out there conceptions of what like the realm we exist in might be, how it might operate, as you say, what the spiritual, hierarchy and reality might be. But you don't like overtly just spit it all out there, because that would be a massive turn off to a lot of people. They wouldn't be able to handle it. You just put it in there and you hinted it. And essentially, if someone knows what you're referring to, it's a bit of a wink. If not, maybe they look it up and they find out themselves. But what I was going to ask was this. The one worry that anyone might have when they start to address certain topics like that like, here, put it this way, I'll just say for people who are like getting a bit lost at what I'm circling around here, I'm not talking about when Joe Rogan's like, so do you think Bigfoot actually exists? It's like, bro, that's the safest possible topic you can ever talk about. Nobody's ever going to shut you down for talking about that. You can talk about Bigfoot, and you can just talk about like silly things, like the most low level, like, are there actually like bases on the moon? You can do that all day long and you'll never get in trouble, which in itself, by the way, if you think about what we talked about earlier, certain agendas and how tech works, that in itself tells you you're going into a cul-de-sac there, that I would say they designed it, and they're totally comfortable with you circling that drain as long as you want. But if you ever go into some of the bigger ones, those absolutely are what can get you censored on the internet. And I'm not talking censored like you then get to do a media tour on YouTube for 2 weeks. Like, that's the fake censorship, guys. I'm talking about the real real ones where you just disappear off the internet completely. I'll even just allude to it. You might disappear in real life. So I'll say this, right? Just before anyone gets scared, I do think if you say things in a very earnest way and you don't go out of your way to upset evil forces, this might sound a bit weird, but like my analogy is always like this. The internet to me is like being in a mafia-run bar. If I'm in a mafia-run bar, dude, I could drop a few breadcrumbs in there, but I'm never just going to scream out, of course, everyone in here knows it's bloody run by the mafia and they'll fucking kill you if you say something. Because, yeah, spoiler, then I'm going to get taken out by two large Italian gentlemen and I'm going to be gone, aren't I? You're never going to see me. I'm going to be wearing the concrete shoes or whatever they used to say back in the day. Like, yeah, I understand that's going to get me fucked over. So I think if you do it in an earnest way and you're not trying to fuck the party up, as it were, and you're not even trying to, like, red pill everyone, you're just trying to sort of like let certain people get through and certain people can just stay at the level they're at, I think you actually are sort of safe. But I'd give you the quick analogy. I remember they made a classic movie about this, which it wasn't actually very well viewed. It was in the 90s. It was called Conspiracy Theory and it had Mel Gibson in it, right? And the reason the premise of the movie was genius was he plays a taxi driver that just has all the conspiracy theories that you've ever heard of back in the day, right? And he's telling everyone who comes in his cab all these theories. And the funny conceit of the movie is like all these alphabet agencies are hunting him down because it turns out one of the conspiracy theories he thought about was true. But the joke is even he doesn't know which one it is. And so he's just sort of like going on half the time like, well, it could be this one, it could be that. And so like I almost feel that's the one area I'd ask you about, which is when you actually touch on those areas, do you ever get a little like pang of anxiety? Do you ever worry about, am I letting too much out in the world even when I'm being a bit controlled?
That's really funny. It's a good question, man. Honestly, maybe a long time ago with certain things, but not now. I mean, I think there's certain things where it's like, well, let me put it this way. Like a lot of my religion and philosophy research has involved like coming to you could say it's obvious, but when you really see it in front of your face, conclusion that like, pretty much everyone ever has lived under like a power structure where they really couldn't say certain things. And I mean, that sounds really obvious, but like when you really see it on the ground, like just an example that's coming to my mind right now, like, you know, John Calvin, who's like a reformer, kind of got Protestantism going in a way to make it very simple. When he was overseeing Geneva, there was this guy, Michael Servetus, who got killed for like denying the Trinity. He wrote a book like, yeah, the Trinity is not really in the Bible. It's not really real. And they like killed him, you know? But nowadays, like who really, I mean, Christians care, but like that would seem totally insane.
Yes.
And so basically what I'm getting at is like, you know, and that was not that long ago, relatively, right? And even, you know, back when America first started going, this is where my research is at right now, you know, certain states had like blasphemy laws where it was like, look, if you say the same thing, if you say the Trinity is not real, you can't live in, let's say, Massachusetts or something, like get out, basically. So I think it's just kind of like part of like the universal like human condition in a way. And we like to imagine that it's not really the case. I mean, most people know if you say like, oh, the king sucks, maybe the king will kill you. But normally it is more like informational and like structural things and things like that. To be totally frank, yeah, I do stay away from certain like topics and things, but I'm kind of lucky because in a way I almost feel like those are like tertiary, like in and of themselves now, and they're not really like that important to me now. I guess if I did feel like they were like the most important thing, I would be in kind of like a moral or ethical jam in a way. But like, you know, let's just say, what's this like a safe one people can talk about? Let's say it was like the JFK assassination. Let's just say hypothetically that I was like, okay, I feel like if you say too much about this, like you're gonna get a knock on the door. I feel like things like that, like, oh, like who was really there on the hill or whatever, it's almost like I'm operating on like a meta level. So I don't really worry about like tripping those wires, if that makes sense. Like instead of making a comic like about the JFK assassination, it's kind of like I would make a comic about like what you're learning in like a history classroom. And like, hey, isn't it weird that like, you know, X, Y, and Z? And like if someone wanted to draw the conclusions of like that. But also, you know, honestly, now that I'm saying this, you know, I really do feel like maybe the reason I'm way more comfortable now is that I really am operating in like the domain of like metaphysics and spirituality and stuff, because that naturally is where I am. So yeah, I'm not really so worried about that anymore because
Sounds like you're just better at what you do. Like you don't sort of give your hand away too blatantly, right, in a way that you haven't thought about. I mean, this is actually something I was going to get to anyway, which is like we've been talking around this. So let's just get into it. Basically, one of the things you do with your comics as well is, I mean, the movie Inception is going to be the perfect analogy here. You incept some of your ideas into people's heads through what looks like a silly comic. And I noticed your main trick that you're very good at, something I've tried to do in my own work when I want to sneak an idea in there, is if people don't know, right, there's been a recent like revelation or epiphany that some people have had in certain like right-wing and conspiracy circles, which, spoiler, is just parallel thinking, guys. This is literally what fiction is. You haven't arrived to a new idea. What they realized, Owen, is like, oh, if I actually just write a book about what I politically think about today with all the names in, I'm going to get banned. But if I was to write a sci-fi novel, it's like, bro, that is literally what all the great sci-fi and fantasy novels were. They were all like a guy taking his worldview and philosophy and playing it out in this like his own little sort of sandbox, as it were, but the implications and inferences were always to a sort of reality of his life and what he thought and what he's interacted with the world in. So essentially, like, I've noticed that's something also that you're doing is like you wouldn't, like you say, you wouldn't be as blatant as to be like, here's what happened in the JFK. What you would do probably is something silly, like you'd describe the way someone got fired in a big company, and that you'd just use illusions, which if someone could pick up the breadcrumbs would essentially be like how you would deconstruct the spiritual reality, what happened, the literal reality, the conspiracy. You just seem like you're better at your craft now, right?
Yeah, that's definitely a factor. Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about it. Yeah. I was like, interesting. Like, why is that the case? But I think that a big part of it probably is that I really do feel like hooking back, like partially to where we started, like, because the spiritual reality of like the good and evil forces is kind of like primary in a way. It's almost like, yeah, that's part, like the mafia example that you used is a perfect example. Like, yeah, if you're in a bar run by the mafia, like you could say that and get thrown outside. But if you think that like the evil that they're doing is just a manifestation of like actual, like larger cosmic spiritual warfare, well, you can talk about the spiritual warfare. I mean, people are fine with that. And it's almost like that's like the real, like primary reality that I see. That's a part in scripture, by the way, in case some people don't know, but in the Bible, it does say like, we don't wrestle against literal like physical people and organizations. It's like powers and the cosmic level. That's actually what we're wrestling with. To butcher that quote literally as much as possible.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So I think that's part of why. Yeah. That's, you asked me a really good question. I was really thinking about it, but yeah, I think that's partially why, like the primary thing. And then also it hooks back into another reason why I got obsessed with all this stuff is seeing it play out in people's actual everyday lives. Like, honestly, it sounds kind of random, but like even something like the opiate crisis and people, drug overdosing and all that, I feel like that really was a big part of me getting involved in all this because, I don't know what it's like there, but in the US, like there really is like a hardcore like opiate crisis and deaths and deaths of despair and all that stuff. So in a weird way, you asked me a really good question. In a weird way, I feel like that also is part of the key to the answer, because a big part of why I guess you could say I picked up the project that I do is, I was like, I can't hear about another person like one town over getting found in their trunk or in their backseat of their car having overdosed on heroin. Like, I literally can't hear another story like that and not do something about it. Like, maybe at the time I was like, maybe it's stupid to think that like I as like an artist could like try and do something to address this like larger situation, but like I have to try. And that was a really big jumping off point, maybe the biggest one, because, again, I'm just using your analogy. If like, evil forces are controlling your city and they're going to throw you in the alleyway for saying something about it, at a certain point, it's kind of easy to be like, well, I can't really do much about that. And even if I did, like, what would I do? Like, take over the whole city? I don't know. Yes. But when you're seeing the trickle down into people's lives and you're like, here's my friend's sister who's really depressed because this like weird propaganda about what she should be doing with her life really got to her and now she's on the wrong path. Here's my other friend who's like drinking himself to death. Here's my other friend who's stuck in this position of X, Y, and Z. So it's almost like I saw that and I was like, okay, I can touch those things. Like, those are right in front of my face. And even though they're hooked up all the way to the cosmic scale, that's kind of like what I feel like I have to try and do something about. So that's really kind of the answer to like the question, I guess you could say. It's almost like that middle level of like the mafia bosses in the city is like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like almost, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it's just like a symptom of on the ground and then the higher cosmic scale. And I'm kind of pointing at like those two things, I guess.
Let me spin it into something then. So another thing I would ask, and I'd tie it into what you've just said there is there some level on which if you do, because if you notice it, that when you read, especially Christianity, a lot of it is along the ideas of like, you yourself can be an agent for change and you can be an agent for good and a force for good and all that. But if you notice, it's always essential. This is like a key aspect of the protocol, is it must be done in sort of an unselfish way, or in a way where it's not about your ego, or it's not about like just hurting other people who just because you're upset and lashing out. It's like if you do it almost in a way where it's like you're the vessel that's acted through, you can sort of sometimes do it yourself. So what I would ask, two-part question is, one, do you feel like something protects you from having to worry about some of these darker forces? And two, perhaps it's tangential, is you actually thinking in that moment, like, as someone who's tapped into certain ideas, I can't just let, like, for example, my sister think this thing and the fear and uncertainty she's getting through whatever, a screen or some social norm or someone who's over, I can't just sit back and do nothing. Do you think some of that is actually potentially good or positive spiritual forces acting through you in the world?
Yeah, man, that's a really, really good question. Does something protect me? Well, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I would kind of flip it and say that even though it might sound kind of insane, after years of running my little operation here, so I moved out of New York City to the middle of nowhere to run my little like theological art studio. So like I'm like all in, just in case people don't know. This is not like a hobby over here. Like what I'm talking about, like this is like my whole life. After a few years, I really do feel like there is something like guiding my process. I would say it more like guiding rather than protecting necessarily. Sometimes I joke that there's like some like low-ranking angel who like, spilled coffee or something and got bumped all the way to the bottom of the ladder. And now their job is to like help me run this situation here. But I really do feel like that because especially as an artist, I imagine that maybe you've experienced something like this, but it's like, especially in the arts where I could do like anything, I guess, over time, there's just so many instances where I'm like, oh, maybe I should pick up this tiny thread and pair it with this box over here. And then a year later, I'm like, oh, wow, that was actually so essential that it's crazy. Or I really get a strong inclination, I should read this book. And it'll become a comic, and then someone will contact me and say, oh my God, I read this thing. And there's just so much like guidance that it really doesn't feel like a random process. And it does feel like something is stewarding the process on a larger scale. And I just kind of show up. Honestly, what it really feels like is I just show up here every day for work and like it kind of just happens. I mean, I grind really hard and it takes a toll on me. But in terms of the development, it really does feel like something is stewarding that development. So I don't think about it too much, but yeah, I really do feel that way actually, for sure. Just because over like 4 or 5 years, my art career goes much longer than that. There's so many times where you get such a strong inclination to start something and you have no idea how it's going to play out, but then it turned out to be crucial or whatever, that, yeah, I do feel like there's something kind of like stewarding the process. I wouldn't say protecting, but maybe that goes with it. Stewarding, providential, has an air of protection maybe. And as for the other thing, you said, oh yeah, like you can't sit back and just like watch other people go through, whatever. If you have like the key and they're locked up, you can't just like sit there. It really feels like you have to do something. Yeah. And is that like a result of like larger good forces? Honestly, I would say definitely 100%. To get a little heady with it, I guess, it is really interesting to think about like the method of action there and what the deal is. Like,
that famous one, you'll have heard this a million times, everyone has. It's one that unfortunately religious people always use as a story, but it'll never get through to the rational materialists. They'll just see it as like what we said, superstition, like that doesn't mean anything. That famous story where it's like there's a guy and he's in whatever, for some reason, I can't remember if it's a plane crash or whatever, he's in the ocean and he prays to God, like he thinks, whatever, may as well going to die anyway, so I may as well just pray, like, come on God, please save me. And then the joke is, like you've heard this, everyone knows knows the story, but I'll play it out. You know, a boat comes along and goes, hey man, you want to come on? And he goes like, no, it's all right. You know, I'm waiting for God to save me. So the boat goes away. And then, you know, I'll put in another one. Like a guy in a raft comes by like, hey, come on here, mate. Come on. He goes, no, it's all right. Look, if God exists, he's going to save me. And then, you know, the famous thing is like, whatever. I can't remember if in the story he dies or whatever. And then basically he gets to see God and he goes, why didn't you save me? He's like, what do you mean? I sent a boat on a fucking raft. like to the rational materialist guy, they're just going to go, see, it's just another example of primitive mind trying to make sense of the world. It's like, to me, I don't know for you, to me, that's like, I think that story is real in the sense of like, it's true. Like I have this thing I do where I say there's some things that they didn't actually happen, but they're true. Like they just tap into something vital that just has like an emotional resonance to me. Like I do sort of think that's how the world works in a fucked up way, mate.
Yeah, no, there is definitely an aspect of that for sure. That's really funny, by the way. Yeah, well, you know, it kind of hits into a lot of the stuff I've been going into really hard in my studies, because there's a lot of different like models for kind of like viewing how God like interacts with humanity and what that means for like human wills and society and people's free will, and, you know, how much we can depend on like X, Y, and Z. And it hits a few other topics like, you know, the future, like does God know the future, and
yes.
Is it all written out or whatever? For me, the two things it kind of makes me think of is like, I have a few models for it. I mean, even if someone is sort of like a rational materialist, I think for me, it's like you can kind of look at humanity and people and how they act. And there really is sort of like this magnet, I guess you could say, like spiritually or even just morally. Let's just say morally. It doesn't even have to be magical, even though I kind of think it is. That it's like a magnet like above us that kind of draws us towards the good. Like clearly, even if you're like, take a really bad person, he still has some moral sense. And even if it's disadvantageous to us in terms of like evolution or, you know, hoarding resources, or, you know, maybe I could steal $50 from you and get more food for my family. Like technically in a Darwinian sense, that would be like, fine. I mean, who cares?
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
It's nature, right?
Yeah.
But there is this kind of like lodestone or magnet, like drawing us towards the good, like in some way that I think is actually real for sure. I mean, like in your example, you know, if the guy with the fishing boat just rode by the drowning person and someone was like, oh, you're not going to save him. And he's like, nah, it's too far, you know, whatever. Normal people would be like, dude, that's insane. Like we have to go save him, because
sure.
We're drawn towards this like mechanism.
No, by the way, I even think what you're saying does have a reality to me. Like, I'll tell you what, one thing I've found that is like, because another thing that this discussion will inevitably have to come around to is, since we're talking like on some level, we're sort of like, I don't know about happy, but we found some level of mooring in the world and things that we can rely on as a touchstone. And we're not like just lost and scared and stuff. People are always going to ask the question, like, how do I get to that point? Well, one thing I would say along these lines that you're talking about basically is, let me think how I would phrase this. Fuck, I lost my track for a second there. Let me think. What we were just saying about right there. Fuck, where was it?
People being drawn up towards.
Yes, that's right.
Good.
What I would say is this is actually, it'll sound mad, but when people see how dark the world is, and especially if they look at any conspiracy stuff and the rabbit holes, dude, because so many of them, spoiler, I think they're booby trapped, and I think some of them are even set up by the evil forces. Like there is a way to siphon off people who otherwise might head towards real ideas that could change their life. One of the actual classic conclusions of so many of them, whether it's like the banking thing or what's going on with education or what's going on with, let's just say, like the safety of children or something, they all end in this really black pill, like it's just evil and you can't stop it and they're going to kill everyone. Just save yourself while you can. I don't feel that at all. Like, here's the thing I've actually come to as a conclusion I want to bounce off you, is the actual vibe I have, dude, is the opposite. I actually find that you have to be incredibly systematic. You have to use all sorts of like mental coercion, physical coercion, literally sometimes the threat of people's lives, the threat of their livelihoods through money and social and what people think about. You have to bombard them full spectrum with these ideas and these concepts of what I would say are evil or what would draw you towards evil, to make normal people and even people who've gone down these evil paths be evil and do evil things. It's like the joke is, there is no military that really does go, guys, we're the evil ones and we're going to go and fuck them all up because we're evil. We're just pieces of shit. Let's kill everyone. Every military is, we're the heroes. They're the bad guys. We're doing this for a cause. We're doing this for it. It's like, there's almost something confident about that, dude, that even to make evil happen, it feels like it requires way more effort to make evil happen than it does for just good to happen. I feel like people naturally, like you're saying, are drawn to some sort of higher good.
Yeah, we definitely, yeah, dude, for sure. I think C.S. Lewis talks about that in Mere Christianity somewhere, that like to do evil, you kind of have to like appeal to the good, and that's sort of evidence for this like higher standard in and of itself. But yeah, man, I mean, it's really interesting because this is a huge, so like deep down, let's say like not that deep, but let's say like one or two layers down into like theology world, this is like a huge discussion because it touches on like the very hot button issue of like, are people like fundamentally bad? Like, are people just bad straight up, like all the way through? And then maybe God like turns the light on in us if we're lucky, or can people just be good and they're kind of good, or they could be bad, or is it a mix, or like what's the deal? It has to do with like original sin, like Christianity world and stuff like that. But it's like a huge topic of discussion. And it's funny because you pick up like certain things along the way from different groups. I really enjoy going into something called Calvinism. I mentioned John Calvin before, but their vibe basically is like, yeah, you know, people are sort of like totally, there's nothing in human nature that's left untouched by like some kind of corruption or evil. But at the same time, they have this idea that I really like a lot. I'm not Calvinist, but I like this idea a lot. I think it's called common grace or like social grace or something. But the idea is basically that like, if you look out at the world, the fact that people aren't like descending into like total cannibalistic barbarism, like just murdering each other all the time, and like that we're not actually as low as we could be, is kind of evidence of God and him, let's say, spreading like a flower with pollen or whatever, or like the magnet analogy is better, kind of drawing us up towards this moral righteousness, I guess you could say. Because yeah, like you're saying, I mean, you could take it either way, but the fact that people really aren't appealed to by like, hey, let's go murder this guy and take his stuff. Like normal people find that like morally abhorrent.
Yes.
They're really not just doing it out of, well, what if we get caught? You know, if your friend said that, you'd be like, dude, what's wrong with you, man?
Sure.
And yeah, that was a big part of me coming around to a lot of stuff spiritually. Just that I felt that I really couldn't explain a lot of things that we're talking about in terms of just appealing to the scientific morality and Darwinism and all that. I really felt like there was something else at play. And that was a big like thread that I followed really, really far. Just like finding the thread of like what you were just saying, like, well, yeah, people do kind of like want to do good, even though it inconveniences them. And people do kind of have this aversion to evil, usually, even if it could benefit them. Like, why is that? And following that thread led me to some pretty interesting places.
Right, again, in my field of work, even though what I'm doing could be reduced and sound so boring, like you're just making up stories about people who play professional video games. It's like, spoiler, guys, I always say this. Like, at the end of the day, Michael Jordan was just a guy putting a ball through a hoop. And essentially, that's even some sort of like fucking mad conceptual thing. Like, it was the fact he put it into the hole of the hoop, not the butt. It didn't hit the sides. That was, you know what I mean? You could go into a whole thing on that. But we all know, if you love sports, these people are almost like fucking Hercules or Thor or something when you think about the terms that people are able to use to describe them and the level the narratives go to and the mythological resonances they have. So one thing I like to do in my work is try and tap into like narratives and archetypes. And the funny thing was, in the early days, I'll be totally honest, I thought I was actually just like, right, what I thought quite reductively was like, this space is just so limited and people aren't going beyond the most basic sort of sports level, that what I'm going to do is, because I've got interests reading outside of this space and I'm into metaphysical concepts and mysticism and stuff, I'm going to use things I take there and bring them back into the esports world. And initially, I had the arrogance to think, you know, I'm the one doing this. But I have to say, my actual sort of lens I look at the world through now would be more along the lines of, I actually often describe now, I don't think I make the narratives up, mate. What I do is, I look out there, and when I see the world now, that is just the lens I see the world through. So when I see this professional player, I don't just see someone who plays a specific role in the game with these skills. I see a guy who's like, he was the guy who was always the loser who kept losing in the finals or the semi-finals, and clearly he's battling some sort of like spiritual weight that's on his shoulders to break through or to believe in himself in the key moment when all is called into question. And I'm going along mythological angles, and so to me, I don't even feel like it's coming from me. I feel like I'm uncovering it, and then when I actually am able to describe it and express it is when I'm sort of, then I tap into, I often say it's a bit like the Stanislavski method of acting, where the idea is you touch on your own real emotions and memories and you conjure up that feeling feeling for real inside yourself, but then you express it through the vehicle of the character. I'm sort of pairing the two, and where I successfully sort of am able to make a connection, it'll feel like some incredible thing that you might think just came from my mind, but I don't think it did. So what I'm going to lead into here is an area I found very interesting about your work. I would give you a quick side story about two people I'm very interested in artistically, and they're very, very famous mainstream people. They're Alan Moore, the comic book writer who did Watchmen and V for Vendetta and all that jazz. Everyone who knows comics knows this guy. And then the other one would be the guy who wrote the music in the band Oasis, which is Noel Gallagher. And these are two people where essentially their vision of what imagination is or where ideas come from, I thought would be really interesting to spark a little discussion with you here, which is Alan Moore, because he himself got heavily into the occult, he actually sees the world of imagination. You can see where his magical thinking has come into this. He sees the world of the imagination as like essentially a realm within that the human mind either overlaps with or connects to. And it's not that you're really just like a little flesh bot like the materialist would think, and then your brain just fires a crazy little circuit and a weird idea pops like, oh, what an interesting idea, just from his brain only. To him, it's more like you're exploring a landscape, which in the case of if you go and do a character someone else wrote, they sort of, it's like they Lewis and Clark, you know, they went out there and they mapped it out a little bit for you, and you can follow along and you can pick up the trail and find extra parts. He sees it sort of like that, right? And so to him, that's why also he connects into the religious thing so heavily. And then Noel Gallagher has a similar concept, mate. He sees ideas for songs and song lyrics as just sort of being out there in the ether. And the way he describes it, he's like a working class British guy, so he doesn't have the eloquence of Alan Moore, but he just describes it as like, he will actually say that like Bono from U2 or Bob Dylan or something, he'll say like sometimes one of them will have a song and I'll be like, I think I was going to do that one next, or you know what, you would have had this song that I would have done if you'd have sort of tapped into that whatever mental state at this particular time. He almost sees it as they're things that you download and they're expressed through you. So what would you say to this aspect? Obviously, it's a pretty far out there idea for people who've never thought about it. But to me, I feel like a lot of artists are sort of at least circling this topic. It's not as simple as like you just sit there. I mean, it's basically the same concept as with the psychs, right? People think psychedelics is like, it's just your brain firing colours and things like, mate, the fucking movie I'm seeing in my mind's incredible. It isn't just a kaleidoscope, you know? So what would you say to this topic?
Yeah, man, that's so interesting. There's so much there. Well, I definitely found what you said about your own story super interesting. I feel like that's extremely archetypal, at least in my world. I had something kind of like that, where in the beginning, when I first started working with symbolism, so like, you know, I draw stuff, right? Obviously, you can imagine me going along, and then eventually I'm like, oh, like symbols, like symbolism, like stuff means things, you know, and I build up a little folder of symbols. There was a time period, I remember this so well, where I could just kind of combine them randomly and be like, oh, this is like kind of deep. You know, it seems kind of deep if I just take like, you know, a guy and his, you know, his head is a hand and the hand's holding a ladybug, and here's a tree, and above the tree is a moon. This is pretty cool. It's kind of deep and it seems like it means something, you know. But I had this feeling that you kind of sparked with what you were saying, where eventually I was like, oh, wait, like, but this isn't just random. I'm not just connecting like random circuits here. Like there is something, the analogy I used to use is like the landscape of the imagination. If there was no, let's say like higher reality or anything, it would just be totally flat and you could just drive and it would just, there were no bumps or anything, you know, but that's really not what it's like. If you go into the landscape of the imagination, it's more like in a big bed. You can feel around the sheets and you can feel when there's something under there, you know? And that in and of itself is really weird to say like, wait, but this landscape of ideas that isn't even like real, I guess is what I thought at the time, sort of has like an innate structure to it and has these innate patterns and these innate tendencies. That's a really good word. And yeah, it's funny. Like, so you made me think of it, what you said, where you're like, oh, I'm just kind of building these. You didn't say this, but like, oh, I'm just kind of building these stories, you know, I'm making it up. And then you're like, oh, wait, no, these are kind of real, actually. Like, and I'm finding
at least the good ones are, if you know what I mean. Like, I could do a shit version myself, but then that does feel like I came up with it. The really good ones. The more I look back, it's almost like, dude, did that even come from me?
Yeah, no, dude. Well, that's a huge thing in the arts for sure. I mean, people don't really think about it, but like in Greek times, you know, you had the muses, and the muses would come and whisper the creation to you. They would tell you what to do, basically. You could say it's real, or if it's not real, then it's a metaphor for like getting these ideas from the outside. And I do that now, honestly, like, especially for the stories and everything. But even for images, I really don't build them from scratch. I really don't come in and like say, oh, I have this metal piece and this metal piece. Does this fit? Or they're really delivered wholesale to me. Honestly, that's really just how it feels. It really is just like, oh, look, here's this perfectly formed idea that just showed up on my desk. Like, great. And I guess I do participate in it. I mean, obviously I do, but there's that feeling of discovering something that is already there that is very difficult to write off over a long enough period of time. Plato had this idea. I forget how to say this word. It's something like anamnesis. It's the opposite of amnesia, but it's like the loss of forgetfulness. So amnesia, you forget stuff.
Okay.
But anamnesis, you lose the forgetfulness. And it's like, oh, I'm kind of familiar with this thing. That's weird. Like the forgetfulness goes away. I feel like creation, especially artistically, has that feeling sometimes. Like I'll make a really solid painting or a solid image, and it's like, oh, this isn't really new. I feel like, you know, deep down in my mind somewhere, I knew this was there, or it was floating out in the ether or something like that. And yeah, I definitely feel that way. I mean, it's really weird, man, because it hits full speed into a lot of the crazier theological and philosophical stuff that I work with, because to me, the question really being asked is like, it's like, how much does the structure of reality and all that permeate through everything versus how much of it is like a chalkboard blank slate? And that to me more and more kind of colors everything. Like, to make that not a really abstract metaphor. So like a lot of creation for me has to do with like God. You know, God created the universe, we create stuff. You know, it's hard for me not to draw that parallel sometimes. And I lately have just been banging my head against the wall of the question of like, well, you know, here's a great example. So like we were talking about checkerboards and how the squares fit together and everything. I initially was in this world of like, well, God made everything, right? Obviously. So it could have been any way. I mean, he could have done whatever he wanted, you know? But then you're looking at a checkerboard and you're like, well, these squares, like they really do just fit together this way. You know,
there's order, right?
Could circles fit together the way a checkerboard could? No, they couldn't, because that's not what circles do and that's not what squares do. Okay, so I guess when God was making the universe, it kind of, you know, had to be this way. You know, or logic, like 1 + 1 = 2. Could 1 + 1 have equaled 7? I would say no.
Yes.
But then once I pulled that pin out, man, dude, it still is like I'm still picking up the pieces, because it's like once you pull that pin out, you're like, oh, so like I guess if that's how it had to be, then God, when he created the universe, is working within this inherent structure. And then it just spills out for like everything. Like then I'm looking at paintings, and I'm looking at a great painting, like let's say the Mona Lisa, and it's like, well, on the one hand, yeah, Da Vinci made this up, but on the other hand, isn't it beautiful because of this harmonious relationship between the colors? And isn't the harmonious relationship between the colors sort of just a part of reality? I mean, Da Vinci didn't make that.
Yes.
Isn't it partially beautiful because of the composition, and the composition accords with the golden ratio? But he didn't make that either. So then I'm sort of in this world where I'm like, yeah, I guess like it's easier to imagine almost that out there in like the ether, the Mona Lisa was like inevitable, that inevitably this nice combination of colors that is part of the fabric of reality, and these nice harmonious visual relationships that are also part of the fabric of reality. I mean, how could they not be combined eventually into this picture that I'm looking at right here? So that's bizarre, man. And then you're like, well, he's not a robot. He's not just like doing it, but you start to play in this weird space of like finding things and using reality to create, rather than what we conceptualize creation as, which is making up things out of nothing.
Yes.
And it touches on the theology stuff. Of course, it always comes back to that for me, because a really big discussion, it's not really a discussion because everyone kind of feels like it's settled, but an interesting thing to think about is we basically take for granted within Western theology, within, let's say, Christian theology in general across the board, unless you're like really a fringe weirdo, something called creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, meaning God created the universe from nothing, like just boom, snap it into existence.
It's basically the fundamental principle most people operate on. I mean, the joke is they've even tricked people in the atheist world. That's what the Big Bang premise is. You know? Because I always think, by the way, all the modern materialist stuff is just like a really shitty Fisher-Price version of religion. If you look at what they're tapping into and what they're playing on, what they're triggering, you know.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure a priest came up with the Big Bang theory.
He did. It was exactly.
But anyway, so there's other conceptions of that. There's something called creation ex materia, which would basically be that God created the universe in the way that you would create a house. You create a house, but you're working with stuff that's like already there.
Right.
So there's something about that that's super interesting for me. I wouldn't say like I believe that like totally or anything like that. But as an artist, that is how I create things. Whatever's true about how the universe was created, I create things in the second department. I take the paints. I don't make the paints. I take the color relationships. I don't make those. So you land in this really weird space, man, where I could definitely see how there's a really interesting parallel with Oasis, and I'm familiar with Alan Moore. But yeah, you land in this really interesting space where you're like, on the one hand, I'm not a robot just like discovering things mechanistically that exist out there. But on the other hand, my actions are not totally free in the creation department. I am working with the structure of reality in a way.
Yes.
And that's been so insanely interesting, dude. It's been so insane, man. Because then it bleeds back into all the art stuff. I mean, I used to do calligraphy, for example, and that would probably be the art form with the most restriction. If you're making a calligraphic letter G, well, at the end of the day, it has to look like a G. You're working within the structure. Yes, but by doing that, you're afforded an insane level of creativity and freedom. I mean, people spend their whole lives doing calligraphy. So it has the most kind of rules and structure, but that structure gives you the freedom in a weird way. And yeah, man, in being inside that paradox, whether it's creatively or philosophically, has been totally insane for me. And then again, just to like tie it to one other thing, you mentioned with the stories, it really bleeds into everything. Like you mentioned Proust before. It's like you touch one thing and it's rabbit holes into everything, because you were mentioning the stories. I mean, for me, like the story of a human developing over time and why that's compelling and why other people find it compelling, which they clearly obviously do. I mean, I've even watched like a ton of videos about people like, getting really great at video games, even video games I've never played. It's almost like you can just resonate with it. To me, that touches on like what the purpose of life is and like why we're here and all that. There's a term in philosophy theology called telos, which is telos, which basically is that things have like an inherent purpose, like a pen. You can look at a pen and be like, oh, it's supposed to write. That's its like teleological function. Yes. But it's almost like everything has like a function in that way. And I think that part of why those stories are compelling is like refining skills and bettering ourselves and like rising up higher is part of the structure of reality that, again, we're like working with. So yeah, man, that's like one of what you touch on there is kind of like one of the things that I've been wrestling with so hard, because you just touch that button and it touches everything from like God making the universe to doing art to why am I watching this 4-hour video of a guy speedrunning Mario Party to why am I, it like touches everything because it has to do with like how we participate in reality and like what that means.
Oh, absolutely. I would even say that's one of the areas where, again, I thought I was just taking what was like a simplistic little kid's field, and I'm the one who was bringing in like all these like revolutionary ideas. And the joke was, it wasn't. It was like the impact they had on my life, I just realized could connect to things that, like you say, it's almost like I was just uncovering what was already there. Like I actually do get the sense, I'll tie it into the music and artistic idea in general, right? I know a classic thing a lot of people get, it's a speed bump for a lot of people in the creative process, is when, for example, there's plagiarization. So a classic example, if people don't know, would be, I mean, Noel Gallagher himself has done it loads of times, but a classic example would probably be Led Zeppelin. If people know the music of Led Zeppelin, probably half of their tracks, I might even be being mean by saying half, probably half of their tracks, they just did steal like melodies or even sometimes the name of the track or some basic riff from like a really old-fashioned blues song from maybe 30, 40 years earlier. Oftentimes ones obviously without copyrights and for people that weren't commercially releasing, etc. It was just like done in a way that was a folk tradition. And what's funny is people will see that, and there's two ways they go. Either that it's like they don't care about that fundamentally, which I would suggest probably means you just don't really care about truth and stuff. But the problem is, I think the area people get hung up on is they'll just be like, well, they just stole it, therefore they didn't do anything with it. And really, like, we should go and listen to the original version of that. And it's like, bro, this is how you know they did something with it. Go and listen to the original version of some guy in like 1920 on a like fucking acoustic guitar doing his version of what, like, Jimmy Page turned into some epic guitar solo riff. Like, they clearly, like, essentially to me, they have stolen it, but it's why that saying exists, that, you know, good artists like imitate or whatever, but great artists steal. It's like they've made it their own though. Like they've used their own, they've taken, something that was there that, spoiler, I don't think that person came up with whole cloth. As you're saying, I have a similar vision for the artist himself. I don't think anyone could create anything from whole cloth from nothing. I think at a minimum, we're taking things that already exist. And the key thing is, the more they have power and resonate, implies that you're touching on something that's outside of yourself, that isn't you. You didn't come up with it. And if you can do something brilliant with that, then look, you did on some level steal, you copied something, but you also had to go through your filter, had to go through the lens that is you, as it were. And I'm sure in doing so, there is a creative process. You are adding something your own, like in this case, guitar solo or a different type of singing to it, or you're doing something different culturally with it. What do you think on this topic? Because it's obviously a very touchy one, but I feel like if you're in the artistic world, you can't really avoid this one, right?
No, definitely not, man. Yeah, well, that was something that I really reacted to when I was getting the ball rolling in the arts and everything, because I would say there's kind of like an obsession with novelty in a way that I think is why certain people react against certain types of modern art. Because this obsession of like, oh, he's doing like a new thing really drives the story of modern art from a certain perspective past a certain point. Meaning like, well, this guy painted a blue square. He was the first one to paint a blue square like this. This guy painted a red. And then people kind of react with this groan of like, okay, yeah, but like, who cares? Like, I don't even like looking at this, you know? So that obsession with like, oh, this person's doing something new drives the story, in my opinion, of like Western art past like, what, World War I or something, yes. Pretty much, you know, this guy's the first one to ever put a toilet on the stage, you know? And I really reacted against that. I don't think it's totally garbage, but at least at the time I reacted against it. And I think that's maybe part of why I intuitively ran to like the religious arts, because that is not a thing at all in the religious art world, at least before a certain point. Like if someone paints a picture of a Virgin Mary for a church in Italy in the 1400s, it would be pretty stupid to go and be like, you know, this kind of looks like that other Virgin Mary in the other church. Yes. You're like, yeah, dude, of course it does. And thus the artistry just like shines through. There's an artist from the Renaissance, I think it was Titian, or no, it was this guy named Tintoretto. And above his studio, he supposedly hung this sign that said something like, the drawings of Michelangelo with the colors of Titian. Basically just being like, yeah, I'm going to mix what these two guys did, and that's my whole thing. And he was really good at it. But my point is that I kind of reacted against that like obsession with like novelty and trying to make something new and like, oh my God, this guy can't do this thing this other person did. And in the religious arts, you escape it totally because it's all about forms and archetypes, you know, even in the Eastern arts, mandalas and pictures of Buddha and things like that. So yeah, I definitely tried to escape that, I guess, in a way, also playing to my natural like proclivities and stuff. But in our time, it is pretty interesting. I was really interested in like music with sampling, like beats and stuff like that for a long time. And I think that part of that creative aspect of it and the ideas that it inherently brings forth is part of why I was really into it. You know, you have an album where someone takes like the Beach Boys, like Pet Sounds, and just remixes it and cuts it up and repastes it and puts different drums in. This album's called Pet Sounds in the Key of D, by the way. It's really good. Okay. And it's great. It's a totally new thing that's totally, completely unlike the original. Going to listen, if you were listening to that and you said, go listen to the original, that would be stupid. They're two totally different things. But at the same time, you know, air quotes, all he did was cut up the original and repaste it in different ways. So yeah, it raises a lot of like very interesting philosophical questions that I enjoyed like toying around with. Just by, you know, virtue of it existing. Did he steal it? You know, should he be able to put his name on it, but it's really this other guy's music? You know, that's always been a thing in like sampling music world. But yeah, man, I mean, it's something I wrestle with only a little bit because you get away with it in the visual arts. Honestly, that's really the answer. In my world, you get away with it because if I take a detail from like a painting in the 1500s and just illustrate it, it's actually kind of cool to have that reference, maybe because of the distance, which I have done. And I tell people I do it. I don't like hide it. I hit it a little bit when it has to do with like a titanic figure doing something so massive and powerful that it almost like reverberates out through the medium forever. I mean, a perfect example of that for me is Calvin and Hobbes, man. Like, I used to love Calvin and Hobbes. I know a lot of people do. Obviously, it's like one of the best things ever. But like when I started doing my comics, so now we mentioned like the eclectic, semi-random nature of the comics before. eventually I settled into like, okay, I can have this narrative and this world and I can play around with it as much as possible. But I do have kind of like a world that my comics inhabit now.
Yes.
But like I have my dog, and like we're dealing with like big ideas, and there's like a guy and there's this animal and they're talking about like big ideas. Like at a certain point I had to be like, some people are going to draw the parallel with some things from Calvin and Hobbes, and like I can't escape it. It just is part of the medium and nature of it at this time. So it's not exactly what you asked me, but
I get what you mean.
But like I think that acknowledging that as a condition of the time, and maybe not totally submitting to it, but also not pretending that it doesn't exist, is really like the third way that I've found. It really is a condition like of this time. I mean, the sampling music is a perfect example. People remaking movies, stories, obviously are archetypal and things like that. Something I really think about a lot with the arts is that I had this painting teacher that told me you can never not be a part of your time. You can never pretend that you exist divorced from your time. You can be, against your time and try and push against it. You can try and be outside of it. You can just stick yourself right in it. But whatever it is, you're going to have some relationship to your time period, and you can never totally transcend that. That's something I think is like 100% true. It's part of, I think, why I work as an illustrator. And yeah, I think that question that you're getting out of like, well, didn't this other guy kind of do this sort of, is a part of this time that you can't escape.
By the way, just as an aside, it was also hilarious because you referenced obviously the religious Calvin so often that when you initially said Calvin and Hobbes, I was like, what a weird fucking combination of like philosopher and he means the comic. He means the kids comic. I actually have a question along these lines on that I was thinking about when I actually read your work, because you referenced exactly that, like that it's a famous Calvin and Hobbes story where they find a dead bird, and obviously if you know that sort of story, the sort of that story is a bit. As a comic, it's kind of a little bit Hallmark with a little bit of edgy commentary where it's sort of like, obviously this kid and this dog are sort of referencing things we're all thinking about in life and bigger things, but they are trapped in the conceit of this panel comic and they can never really explore the idea. They can just sort of trigger it in us. One thing I was going to ask you about, because I've also noticed that in the world of comics, this has a very interesting sort of imaginal space that they carve out like you're talking about, is when I would have, let's just say, negative responses to paranormal psychedelic experiences. So basically when you get like intrusive thoughts, or you're getting like almost like a traumatic trigger from something you felt in that moment where it's too powerful an idea and it's making you afraid or anxious. This is many, many years ago. One thing I actually used to do, this just became the technique I figured out, was I would find things that were very, very structurally set in a certain world and place and tone, and they never left that. And so what I would do was I would go to things like that as like my escape hatch to just get away from this horrible thing for a while. And two examples I would give you would be, one was actually Peanuts comics, which I had loads of from when I was a boy, because essentially when you read that world, there's nothing dark in that world, guys. Like, about the worst thing that happens is he fails the baseball game. He doesn't kick the ball when Lucy's holding it. Maybe every now and then Linus might reference something about life or something like that. But even so, the kids are always the same age. They're always going in circles, doing the same things. It's always a different twist on it. It's a bit funny. It's a bit sentimental. It's so safe that I could get away from these larger ideas that were scary. Another one would be, if you've ever seen the TV show Psych, where this guy pretends to be psychic because he's actually just got like super duper skills at being a detective, but he's not a detective, and that's how he works with the police. It's the same thing, because it's a comedy, mate. Even though again he's solving murders, you're never actually scared he's going to die. You're never actually scared like, oh my god, what's this imply about human trafficking or something? You're not thinking about that. You're just in this silly world watching this guy do these things, go through the motions, and you can just escape from it. I'll even give us a final example. It's actually why, even though this will sound mad sensitive to people who know me, they'll probably think this is funny, mate. I can't, for this reason, go and read Winnie the Pooh, though. Because the reason why is, if you've ever seen the movie versions of the Winnie the Pooh stories, that, like, I don't know if it's Disney or whoever it did it back in the day, they put that framing into it, which is like this, but way more sort of like fucking heartbreaking. They put that element into it where the idea was, it was someone telling these stories to his son, and his son was Christopher Robin, right? right? And it's like he goes into that world, but that's only when he's a boy. And so when he leaves that world, it's like he leaves Winnie the Pooh behind. And then they're all just off in whatever, the 5-acre fucking village or whatever it was called, wood or whatever it was. And that actually breaks my heart. Like, I can't think of that. Like, it's almost like that's like opening a painful relationship when I think about that, because they framed it that way. They didn't just let me escape into it. They sort of showed me that, like, there's almost a quality of, like, that they are real for me when I go into that story. Do you get what I'm talking about?
Dude, totally. 150 million%, man. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's funny because I've often drawn inspiration from a lot of unexpected places, at least for me. And I think that's a big part of why, like, things like sitcoms and things like that are one of the art forms, like, of this time. I mean, you can say they're not really art. I mean, whatever, it's subjective. Some of them are banal and stupid, sure, obviously. But they clearly have some, like, relationship, like, to this time,
Yes.
And I really think there is something about that. In a weird way, they're kind of like comics. A sitcom has 9 seasons of 20 episodes. It has, like, 500 instances or whatever. It's kind of is like a comic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of why that format is so interesting to me. Not just a sitcom, but like something like that, where there is like a world that you step into, and I wouldn't say it's like controlled, but there is like a controlled element to it. Like you said, like Charlie Brown's not going to get like, a weird disease. It's just not, it's not on the table.
There's no terrorist going to cut his head off or anything,
Yeah. And it's like funny. It's funny to think about that because
Exactly.
it's so something that would never happen. So in a way, yeah, there is like an escapism element to it. I used to have a negative connotation to the word escapism. 100%. I used to really just view it as like, well, why would I distract myself from reality? Like, I'm just numbing myself with something. But I read something by J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm not really that familiar with his works as most people are, but he said something like, someone sort of critiqued him for that. Like, isn't your work kind of just like escapist? Like, you're just making these like fantasy yarns for people. And he said something like, if there were 2 people stuck in prison, they wouldn't talk about the prison. They would talk about like stuff outside the prison,
Yes.
right? They would talk about things that like aren't going on right in front of them. I thought that was really interesting, man. And it really changed my relationship to a lot of those fictitious worlds a lot, because it just hit me like so deep. Prior to that, I had kind of like an antithetical relationship to fiction in some ways, I guess, or I just didn't really see the depth of it. But for me, you really kind of touched on it with like the Peanuts thing, because it's like, it's again that thing where it's just, what level are we on? Are we on like, the basic like little Tinker Toys level, or does it fractal up to like the cosmic scale and they're like always connected? There's actually no separation. Because yeah, like you mentioned in Peanuts, like, yeah, like it's just like nothing that crazy. Like Charlie Brown doesn't kick the ball. Like maybe Linus misses the bus and misses school, or like these 2 people, maybe they're not friends for like a few strips or something. But like in a way, those worlds become like safe, controlled ways to experience, this sounds absurd, but to like experience like these fundamental like human dramas. You know what I mean? Sure. Like failure is something that's like so big and looming and like really actually like legitimately scary, that like, let's say a guy takes out a loan for like $1 million and starts a business. I mean, failure is like almost like a monster, like lurking.
Yes.
Whether, obviously, of course it would be. So it's almost like there's something about taking that and flipping it and shrinking it and being like, well, here's Charlie Brown wrestling with that monster of failure, but here it's not like a Leviathan that's going to consume your whole family. Here it's like him looking stupid at the baseball game. And it's a way to like engage with those monsters, I guess, in a way, for me, that's very like controlled. And that goes to like a deeper aspect of like what I think art does and like what I think art is about. Because, a really good example that I can't help but bring up right now is something like African masks, which seems really random. Okay. But a lot of the function of masks in those cultures is, and even like the more totemic, let's say, art and things like that. If you imagine going to a museum and seeing like the African art, not Egypt, but like sub-Saharan Africa, there's like weird figures and masks and things like that. A lot of those things are embodiments of these unseen forces that govern our lives. And I really like that phrasing, because everyone, whether you're someone in like the jungle in the Congo, or you're in New York City right now, or wherever, we're always engaging with these unseen forces that totally control our lives, that are really scary. I mean, it could be like the Illuminati, or it could be like a disease,
yes,
or it could be financial stuff, or
you could say anyone has it, dude. Like, look, as much as I try not to use the cursed political terms, but when people say that term, white supremacy, I just see them as they just put that as a mask over what they see as the most sinister force in the world.
Yeah. So the things that, like, you know, whether they're real or not, or we should actually be worried about them or whatever, the things that are almost like the most real and scary for us, you can't even see them. They're not even, they're not physically real, like the table. So people in those cultures, and now today also, use art to embody it. So like if you're in, like, let's just make a caricature of it. If you're in one of these African ceremonies, here's this mask. This mask is a figure of this god who is disease. This is the disease god. So you're walking around and, you know, you're worried about disease and stuff. That's it right there. You can see it. It's literally right there in front of your face, and you can engage with it in a way that's a lot more tangible and real than like, oh, these people around me get sick sometimes and then we get better. Like, it takes it from that world and puts it like, no, it's literally right here. You're looking at it and you can engage with it directly. To me, there's something about weird parallel, but there's something about things like what we were talking about. Like, here's Charlie Brown engaging directly with failure, but it's not failure that's going to like kill him and put him out on the street into homelessness. It's a safe, controlled, little microscopic of failure, but it's still failure. You know what I mean? It's still social embarrassment. It's still isolation. Loneliness is a really good example. You know what I mean? On most shows or themes or whatever, I mean, there's a part where like a character is like lonely and like engages with loneliness, but it's safe for us to do it in this controlled way, because it's not like, oh, you're dying alone when you're like, you know, whatever years old loneliness. It's like, oh, this guy's at the park alone loneliness. It's a safe way for me to like play with it. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a theme running through our conversation, actually, where it's like, here's this mundane little doodad or whatever, but actually it hooks up into, you know, the cosmic drama itself.
Sure. One last topic I want to briefly broach, and obviously it sounds ridiculous to say this, is politics, which sounds like a ridiculous setup. But what I would say is this, like I just alluded to there, one thing I do very carefully, both because I have a real world job where I've connected it to my person and I can't necessarily say all the quiet things out loud, you know what I mean by that, but also because I genuinely just do think, like this is the way I'm, like you, from my own studies in the occult, I do think that words carry certain powers and certain ideas connected to them are immediately summoned when you say that word. And I call certain words that have been used in the mainstream by political figures, etc., I call them like cursed words that are almost like hexed. And if you just say that word, if you ever self-describe that way, you're a fool in my opinion. Like, you're just playing into their game and they will use that to destroy you and you become very easy to categorize. So what I will say instead is, I'm going to try not to hit those necessarily, but one that's an obvious one in the modern culture is, in the same way as we all, I mean, even sometimes if you grow up in a religious context, do grow up as part of our time, as part of our political milieu. In the modern day, if you're viewing any kind of mainstream media, you don't know this, but you are inherently left-wing by whatever that spectrum used to mean, because that's just the bent of all the material you're being shown and the agenda of certain people that are controlling it. What I would say is, if people even hear the words right-wing, we all know they never hear that. It's a incredibly loaded term. They just think of like the most evil possible things ever that people who might have been connected to those philosophies ever did in history, and that's what it means. I mean, the joke is the term right-wing and far-right may as well just be the same in the modern day, because, I mean, people, without being too reductive, people will say the joke, you know, if you're anything right of Stalin, then you are far-right in the modern context. But it means that people are so scared of it. It's one of the reasons, in my opinion, people run back to that term conservative, even when they clearly don't agree with conservative politics or even a lot of what that's supposed to mean. It just feels safer. When you think conservative, you think of just an old guy, don't you? Sort of like has a different perspective. It just doesn't have the same like ring to it. So what I would say, what I'm getting to here is, I've noticed that your work, whether out of choice or not, is embedded within that circle of people online. People who are in the right-wing area or the conservative thinking. A lot of those people seem to resonate with your work. And one thing I want to get to, this is my own sort of observation, I want to see what you thought of it, is I was wondering actually why stuff like that might be the case. So what I realized was, I actually, when I think of it, I can't actually think of almost anyone beyond people who are a bit woo-woo and they're sort of psychedelic hippies, who is heavily embedded in what I would call like vital or mystical religious concepts who is actually left-wing. Like, to me, the modern left-wing thinking is very much, it's about postmodernism and deconstructing things, and there are no boundaries and categories, and, you know, we can do anything, can be anything. And when you go down that path, you do become very unmoored. And I don't really think it plays into a lot of the religious thinking. Whereas to me, I think actually, and this is an observation I came to recently, I'm sure it's not a unique one, it's just one that was unique to me, is when I thought about it, one of the reasons I would say on some level, if I had to be categorized, I'm somewhat right-wing, because I often describe myself with that like witty line. It isn't my line, mate. I say I'm a monarchist. I'm just not a royalist, as in I come from the United Kingdom. I don't agree with that royal family, but I do think in some sense, something like monarchy or some sort of thing where one or a limited number of figures control things is probably the best way to do it. Well, the epiphany I had was, isn't that nearly all religious contexts ever? Like, the idea is God is the king, or there is, like, even when you're in those religions where, like, there's all these different gods. Yeah, if you ever dig into it, they'll always tell you at the end, no, they're all just like masks of the Godhead. So it all comes back to like one thing at the beginning, or one thing that's higher in a hierarchy of values. And so I think in some sense, to me, that's why I don't know whether you categorize yourself that way, but I can see why your work has played to that crowd, as it were.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, it's a super interesting topic. Part of that, just to explain a little bit, if there is a mystery, part of that is, I guess you could say, like, historical, in the sense that when I described all that stuff before of like, you know, okay, heroin overdose deaths of despair, you know, all that stuff. At first, even though I was like a hyper mystical and religion oriented person, at first I was like, oh, this is like a social and cultural thing. And I kind of gripped this iron rod of like, oh yeah, this is like a social and cultural thing. And if we could kind of just, you know, I see the social and cultural stuff is going down this road and wiring in these things that are incorrect or that I think are incorrect, you know, if we could kind of just figure that out, that's like the issue here, obviously. And I really did think that for a long time, but eventually my nature, I guess you could say, reasserted itself. And also I think this is true, where I was like, oh, actually, this is like not bigger than that in the sense that that's unimportant, but there's other jigsaw pieces fit in, like we've been talking about, like with the spiritual and all of that. So yeah, it's funny because initially I thought that my like spiritual and mystical nature would not dovetail with that stuff. I actually used to have a cork board in my old apartment, in my old studio. And I literally had a line going down the middle, and on it was like left side, it was like political stuff, and right side, it was like spiritual stuff. And I would kind of pin things up. But then eventually I was like, you know, there's actually not really a divide here. Like I literally drew a line down this board, but it's actually like these two things are bleeding together so much. So part of it is that, you know, you can imagine me coming up in like New York City and I'm hitting like, you know, it's funny because like at that time, I guess you could say, when was it? Like 2015, 2016, like all those caricature videos online of like, here's this like, you know, social justice warrior yelling this crazy stuff at a rally, or, you know, those like getting owned videos and stuff. It's funny because I would see people online who were like, this stuff isn't real. Like no one's like this.
Oh, I bet you meet them every day, right?
Dude, I was literally in New York City. So I was like, this is like the only people that I'm encountering.
Yes.
So you can imagine me being like, oh, I get it. Like I get what's going on here. Like there's this thing happening, you know, this is the solution or whatever. Maybe I didn't have the solution, but this is the problem. And then, yeah, eventually the spiritual stuff took over. So part of it is that, like, I kind of did come up in that sphere in a way, you could say. But also, yeah, I mean, a lot of it is because there's this thing about, to approach it in a controlled way, I guess, because it is a huge topic. There's this thing in like real theology stuff and what I would say like deep down in Christianity, where like people kind of have this approach that's very new agey of like, yeah, well, like we all agree, like this is kind of how things are, and like they're, you know, love and like all this stuff, you know. But when you really dig into like Christian stuff, the real stuff, in my opinion, not to like be mean or whatever, it actually does the opposite. It actually kind of posits all this stuff that is very antithetical to conventional wisdom. Absolutely. Let's say, where people are like, follow your heart, like just follow your heart. And the Bible's like, actually the heart is like desperately wicked and it's impossible to know what your heart wants. And you're like, oh, that's kind of the opposite of what I thought, you know, and things like that. So I think there's an aspect of that has pitted, I guess you could say, very left-wing stuff against Christianity in a way, which I think plays out historically. I mean, everyone knows, you know, communism and Christianity were like not friends. You know, it wasn't a coincidence. Sure. And I think that that's part of why there really is a historical like divide there. And I think it touches on a lot of things. For me, when you said something like, I don't know a lot of like lefties who are like very into spiritual stuff. That's like kind of what I got from what you said partially. For me, it gets very difficult to parse that because I come from partially like new age world where people definitely would never say like, yeah, I'm left wing politically. But like their views actually are.
Oh, that's what I meant by like sort of the psychedelic crowd. Like put it this way, all the psychedelic crowd. One of the things that has been so staggering for me, dude, is because I was reading a lot of this stuff that's all from the 70s, Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary and all that stuff. And then when I would interact with it in the modern day, especially the time period you're talking about, post 2016, so we won't say what happened then, but we all know what changed culture, right? Post 2016, one of the things that makes it really hard to read now, dude, is they can't escape the fact that they're absurdly left wing. Like the joke is, even though they're people who claim to have seen like God and fucking experienced the infinite and magical realities and demons and things, they are mega triggered by like a politician now that like the papers are telling them is naughty. You know what I mean? Like they can't escape that sort of. It's like they're almost trapped within that, and they don't seem to realize they're trapped in that like treacle, as it were. And they can't. It's like quicksand for them.
Yeah, no, for sure, dude. And I experienced that in like punk world. I used to be really into like punk stuff. And dude, honestly, that was like, I feel like that was like part of the end of my like full on naivete because I was in like punk world stuff. And then the second that I was like, oh yeah, like what about this? I was like, wait, why is everyone like?
I bet they told you you're a Nazi
right now.
Yeah, but of course.
And then I'm like, wait, or even like lighter stuff, like the banking stuff or whatever. I was like, wait, we're all like punks here. Like, what's going on?
Right.
So untangling that was very difficult. But to get to like the heart of it, I feel like a big part of it is that. Okay, so like within spirituality world, let's just say. There's two totally completely different ball games that people are playing. I think usually without realizing that they are playing completely different games, and it bleeds over or carries over perfectly to the political sphere or social sphere. And I often find that by introducing this element into the conversation, I am able to elucidate a huge aspect of the divide between people. Oftentimes when I'm talking to people, I mean, I'm kind of like obsessive. I'll even do this like with my wife if we have like a little argument or whatever. I'm like, where's the point where we part ways? Where's the point where we're dividing here? Like, let's find it instead of just throwing, I think this, you think this. Let's find the exact point where the departure is. And what I found in spirituality world, especially with like it dovetails with ethics and everything, is that some people are talking about how things should be ideally.
Yes.
And some people are talking about how things are and engaging with that.
That seems like the fundamental divide politically. Yeah, exactly.
It's honestly, it's just the fundamental divide.
You can hear it in the language, right? Like I'll give you the obvious example. Like it's even a classic, I'd even say male-female divide. It often seems like if you ask people about like, well, things are this way, like, but it shouldn't be, and why shouldn't have to do it that way? And then the person often in this case can be the man, might be like, but it is like that, and that's reality, and you don't have a choice to avoid it. And it's like, and if you keep going along, if you take those two perspectives and you can't see, like you're saying, the underlying difference, you'll never get close. You'll talk past each other forever, right?
Yeah, and manifesting that I think is super interesting. I mean, a really good example, it's sort of like actually right in between the spiritual and political, is I just had this friend staying with us. She's like my wife's friend. She's actually cool. I'm going to tell like a negative story about her, but she's cool. She actually is cool. Okay. But so she's vegan, and she's really into like talking about it. I'm cool with that. I used to be vegan and vegetarian for a long time, but I'm not anymore. And we were talking, and that divide was always the divide in the conversation where it's like, yeah, like, I mean, a perfect example is like, yeah, it would be better if we didn't have to eat animals. And I'm like, I don't know, like theoretically, if I like architected reality and I was the one making a totally new system from scratch, like maybe I guess it would be cool to not have to kill anything, like, sure. But like, we actually do need to, and you can kind of manifest that divide where I was like, well, what about these stories from Europe, like in the French countryside, a cow dies and then the family starves to death. I mean, they actually needed to eat the cow. They weren't just like, doing it for fun, so that's just how it is,
Yes.
And I feel like that divide often characterizes a lot of political stuff that often manifests as, left, right, I think, from where I'm sitting, honestly, because oftentimes without realizing it, I think people get into arguments. I mean, guns are a perfect safe example where it's like, yeah, it would be cool if we lived in a world where no one had to own guns, I guess. I mean, I like shooting them for fun, but like theoretically,
Sure.
I could philosophically muse about, yeah, that would be cool, I guess. But then you ask them, like, you know, I used to enjoy doing this online where you just ask someone, like, okay, so if someone breaks into my house and it's 3 a.m., like, what am I going to do? And they're just like, oh, well, that's probably not going to happen. And you're like, okay, but what if it does?
Sure.
And honestly, it was sort of the fun of being online for me at that time back in the day, because you can kind of push people and be like, so, but then what do I do?
Sure.
What am I? And eventually they have to just be like, well, nothing, I guess, but it's probably not going to happen. So I feel like, you know, the culture and everything is very, it feels good to be like, you know, wouldn't it be great if we just like didn't have to have guns, like, and that would just solve everything. Like, it's very simple, it feels really good. I guess kind of in a way you could say it's true, maybe. And then you have to be the bad guy to be like,
Yes.
yeah, but like,
Yes.
I have like a baby here, and like if someone breaks in, like, sorry, dude, like,
Oh, what you're talking about. I can see now also why it's so easy to convince people who lean at all towards the left perspective that they're the good ones and the virtuous ones, whereas it's you're the asshole if you're the one bringing it up. Because essentially, I'll reframe it a different way. To me, the left-wing person is saying, but if we could just put that genie back in the bottle, then wouldn't the world be better without the genie? And then we're sort of saying, like, but the genie's out, it's totally around the world and there's no way to put it back. So, like, to us, that's almost fanciful thinking. Like, let's just look at what we're doing in the world of the genie, as it were.
Yeah, totally. And honestly, it's funny I brought it up because my relationship to being vegan perfectly maps it, because I was vegan and vegetarian for a long time. I mean, I started doing that when I was like 12, and then I don't think I stopped until I was like out of college. So it was a really, really, really long time. And it was a manifestation of my spiritual views, because, you know, I'm like, I don't think I should kill animals, so I'm not going to. 1, 2, 3, baby, like, we're done. Like, this is very simple. And it changed when I switched over my thinking, because I had to, because of the things I was reading and thinking about, of like, but like, I exist in a reality that is not going to change or conform to my ideas on some level, and I have to engage with that reality. It's funny, it's kind of like the art thing we were talking about before, and that's when I started eating meat. I was like, I guess because I'm a creature on earth, I would like kill a chicken and eat it, you know? But at the time, it's just an interesting, not to pick on vegans or whatever, but it's a perfect map, because at the time, you know, we were talking to this girl that was here, and let's say, I'm just going to make something up. Let's say she had some like malnutrition problem, and a doctor was like, you have to eat eggs. She probably wouldn't, dude. And when I was vegan, I wouldn't, man. Like, if a doctor told me like, you need to start eating meat or you're going to get really sick, I'd be like, well, I'm going to get really sick then, dude. That's who I am. I'm not going to compromise. So it's a perfect illustration of this element of like, I have these ideals, and the ideals supersede reality. Where normally, I think, let's say on the ground level with people that are not like caught up in a lot of this stuff, it's usually the opposite. It's usually like, well, there's a lot of crime in my area, I guess I have to buy a gun. They're not thinking like, oh my God, what if in Plato's Republic they're like, I need a gun. Sure. Like, yeah, dude. So that was a really long way of saying that I think that my atypical manifestation of being like a spiritual person bleeds into and colors all that, because it's like, I'm very spiritually inclined, but I'm very anti like new age stuff. And I think even just that folder is like relatively rare. Unfortunately, yes, I'm not trying to gas myself up. Like, if other people are in that folder, like, hit me up. But I think that folder is pretty rare, because those two things usually go together. And there's a lot of like really interesting, weird, like deep history there. Like, you know, like the secular materialism, I guess you could say like liberal, if you were being really sloppy with the terminology, really does kind of relate to a lot of new age stuff, like just as like a breadcrumb, I guess people can look into. But like, the first manifesto of humanism is written by this guy. His name's Pico Mirandola, and he was in Florence, right? In the Renaissance.
Cultist, right? Yeah.
Yeah, dude. So he like writes the first manifesto of humanism, which now if you say humanist, you mean atheist, right?
Yep.
But he was like, oh, Kabbalah and astrology and all this stuff. Like, this is all part of like this one religion. I think they called it like the first theology was actually the term they had for it. So pretty much all the way back, like in a weird way, that kind of like what I would call like new age mindset and a lot of the ideals politically and socially, they go together in this way that's very strange. It's when you really dig into it, it's very, very weird. Like, you know, in Florence, you have the Medicis, like with alchemy paintings on their ceilings, but they're also pumping this other stuff that seems like antithetical to a spiritual view of the world. It's very, very, very strange to go into. And we're like 500 years down the road of it. But as to what you actually asked me, man, it's a weird space to be in. It's a weird space to be in, and I'm going deeper into it and discovering more about it and stuff. Like, and it's a really, I'm repeating myself. It's a weird folder to be in because you're always turning over these stones that are like a new layer of weird stuff. Like, who invented organic farming, biodynamic farming? Rudolf Steiner, kind of, let's just say.
Yes.
But Rudolf Steiner was like a weird mystic, like talking to angels and stuff. And he had like a lot of views about, let's say, race spiritually that people would find weird. So you're like, oh, here's this mystic guy from Germany Austria back in the day, but he like invented organic farming. So I guess he kind of was like a hippie, but he's not a hippie. He would, and you're turning over these stones of like, oh, that's weird. So yeah, man, to answer your question, yeah, I don't think there's many people like that. And also it has to do with the mystic legalist dichotomy that I mentioned a really long time ago. It makes perfect sense that if you're more conservative, that your tendency in religion would be more legalist in the sense of like, I'm not saying this in a bad way, but like, I'm Catholic. Here's the magisterium of the church. I believe in tradition. Here's what the church teaches. Boom, I got it all set up. These guys are way smarter than me. Thomas Aquinas, like, we're set up here, baby. I have this tradition, I'm not saying that is a bad thing. It makes sense that that's the tendency. I vibe with that sometimes. Sometimes I am on that page. But yeah, so it's a weird little overlap of the Venn diagrams that I operate in.
Right. As a last question, I would tell people if they were interested by this conversation, essentially just buy the comic book we're talking about, the Channel 1. It explores all these aspects. Obviously, it does it through the medium of a comic, and it's not maybe as overt at times, although sometimes it is. Like I said, some of the autobiographical stories are very, very raw and absolutely don't pull any punches. So the last question would be this. Is there like another volume of comics coming soon? And how would you explain to someone, if someone wanted to say follow your Twitter, what sort of things will they discover there?
Oh, dude, you just all the way through asking the right questions, man. Perfect. Yeah, I haven't mentioned it or anything. As an artist, I try not to, there's this like study someone did where like when you talk about writing a book, it gives you the dopamine rush of having written it, even though you didn't do it yet. But I will say, yeah, I'm definitely going to do another book. Honestly, I was planning on doing it for the holidays this year, but I got so close and I was like, if I just give myself a few more months or a little bit longer, I can make it something really, really cohesive and better than what I was thinking and going to like hustle out for the holidays. So yeah, I mean, it kind of goes with both sides of the question, but basically what I did for a long time is the first anthology of comics, which is what we've been talking about. If it was a music album, it's like every track would be a different style of music. That's kind of like what it's like in a way. But then after that, I made the book and I'm looking at the book on my desk and I'm like, okay, this is dope. And now I'm doing the next album, let's say, where it is more like thematically cohesive. It kind of goes with what you would find in my current output right now, because I do have a comic that I do 3 times a week that is a series. And yeah, it's basically about me and all the stuff we've talked about. And it is a series. I post it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So that's probably what you would see a lot of on my Twitter, Instagram, things like that. It's kind of the main thing I'm doing right now that perfectly marries everything we've discussed here. And then, yeah, for the next book, again, it ties in with the output. It's all kind of like come together in a way that we mentioned, like some low ranking punished angel, like running my studio, but it really has all come together because now I have this baby. So I had a son, which is bizarre in and of itself. And that, with becoming a father and everything, really takes all these like weird fringe abstract ideas and makes them like very imminent and tangible and pleasant to engage with. And it gives it this kind of like dense core that's running through it, because everything we've talked about, I'm going to have to teach him about all this stuff eventually. And like, what does that mean? And am I just telling him, here's what you should think? Of course not. But am I just not telling him anything? And then authority and our place in civilization and all this stuff. So that's kind of been like the core running through it. So the next book, that'll be like basically the underlying narrative. It'll be like the first year and a half of like having a baby. And then it perfectly dovetails with everything. Like, just to give you an example, like, it's the Proustian thing. You brought it up perfectly. It's like, oh, churches, I need to join a church, but I have a weird relationship to hierarchy and structure. Isn't that kind of like how I went through the medical system having this baby, and I felt like I couldn't trust the structure. And doesn't that kind of touch on, civilization? We have these organizations, but can we really trust them? So you can see that it's again that perfect, like, oh, I'm eating a cookie and now I'm thinking about my summers in France, but it kind of goes together. So yeah, that's what you would find. My social media output, it's the comics, and then it's just a lot of the things that I'm thinking about. I'm always going into like crazy rabbit holes and topics and turning over like certain theological and philosophical questions. So if you came this far, I feel pretty confident you would enjoy it. I'm on Twitter. That's the main hub. So Twitter's the main hub. It's at Owen Broadcast. I'm on Instagram also, same handle, at Owen Broadcast. My website, I have owencomics.com. That's the comics. Owencyclops.com. That's the art. But Twitter and Instagram are the main hub for sure. And I think that's basically the whole story right now. Oh, yeah. And my book, it's called Channel 1. It's on Amazon. If you search Owen Cyclops or Channel 1 on Amazon, it's there. And yeah, it's like my first album, man. I feel really good about it. Now that it's been almost a year or so, I really look at it and I'm like, yeah, I feel good about that. So yeah, check that out also. And that's kind of my whole story, man. That's the whole deal over here.